everyone. Welcome you. You came to get the worldview from yours truly, the honest Jew. Welcome everybody back to the podcast. We are now at the 12th episode. It's been quite an vacation, as I'm sure that it has also been for you. As you can see, I'm at a new location here in the UK, and this will be the next location, so to speak, for the next 10 months or so, somewhere around that. And as you can see, this video, the podcast has been restarted and it will continue in its own way once every week, just like the usual, filming on Wednesdays and then publishing on Thursdays. Might I please remind you that the donations are open on Subscribestar and Ko-Fi. Links for the both will be in the description. I've set the minimum donation for now at £5, but you can donate as much as you want or subscribe monthly if that's more of your thing. Suggestions regarding videos and other things that may come into your mind are accepted either via the comments to this video or via email at thehonestjew1@gmail.com. As you can see, I posted on screen right now, and also on Twitter/X, the handle is at thehonestjew1. Might I remind you please to like and subscribe this video, share it with whoever you think that they may find it interesting. Definitely means a lot to me, especially to bridge this barrier at the very beginning with low numbers. As usual, links and the timestamps are in the description. Starting off first, as usual, with the Americas. NBC News. Justice Department accuses Visa of debit network monopoly that affects price of nearly everything. We allege that Visa has unlawfully amassed the power to extract fees that far exceed what it could charge in a competitive market, Attorney General Merrick Garland said. The U.S. Justice Department on Tuesday sued Visa, the world's biggest payments network, saying it propped up an illegal monopoly over debit payments by imposing exclusionary agreements on partners and smothering upstart firms. Visa's moves over the years have resulted in American consumers and merchants paying billions of dollars in additional fees, according to the DOJ, which filed a civil antitrust suit in New York for monopolization and under unlawful conduct. We allege that Visa has unlawfully amassed the power to extract fees that far exceed what it could charge in a competitive market, Attorney General Merrick Garland said in a DOJ release. Merchants and banks pass along these costs to customers either by raising prices or reducing quality of service, Garland said. As a result, Visa's unlawful conduct affects not just the price of one thing, but the price of nearly everything. Visa and its smaller rival MasterCard have surged in the past 2 decades, reaching a combined market cap of roughly $1 trillion, as consumers tapped credit and debit cards for store purchases and e-commerce instead of paper money. They are essentially toll collectors, shuttling payments between the merchants, banks, and cardholders. More than 60% of debit transactions in the US run over Visa rails, helping it charge more than $7 billion annually in processing fees, according to the DOJ complaint. But the payment network's dominance has increasingly attracted attention from regulators and retailers. In 2020, the DOJ filed an antitrust suit to block Visa from acquiring fintech company Plaid. The company initially said they would fight the action, but soon abandoned the $5.3 billion takeover. In March, Visa and MasterCard agreed to limit their fees and let merchants charge customers for using credit cards, but the retailer said it was worth $30 billion in savings over a half a decade. A federal judge later rejected the settlement, saying the networks could afford to pay for a substantially greater deal. Visa wields its dominance, enormous scale, and centrality to the debit ecosystem to impose a web of exclusionary agreements on merchants and banks, the DOJ said in its release. These agreements penalize Visa's customers who route transactions to a different debit network or alternative payment systems. Furthermore, when faced with threats, Visa engaged in a deliberate and reinforcing course of conduct to cut off competition and prevent rivals from gaining the scale, share, and data necessary to compete, the DOJ said. The move comes in the waning months of President Joe Biden's administration, in which regulators, including the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, have sued middlemen for drug prices and pushed back against so-called junk fees. In February, credit card lender Capital One announced its acquisition of Discover Financial, a $33.5 billion deal predicated in part on Capital One's ability to bolster Discover's also-ran payments network, a distant number 4 behind Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. Capital One said that once the deal is closed, it will switch all its debit card volume and a growing share of credit card volume to Discover over time, making it a more viable competitor to Visa and MasterCard. You know what? This reminds me of what was at some point a sort of conspiracy theory until it was proven to be true. If by any chance you guys remember the days when the Apple iPhone used to have an audio jack, and at one point the audio jack simply disappeared. Well, while from one side Apple really did skew around the controversy by saying that well we switched it and we took it off because we're trying to make our phones thinner, and unfortunately well back then but it was the case back then, but it was also the case today. If you want to implement a solution, you will find it. But while they said the public story was that we're trying to make our phones thinner, which is why we've taken it out. That also started was forced to some extent a new market into wireless headphones and other devices, but specifically headphones, the things that they used to be wired with one of those 3.5 millimeter jacks. Now you either have to use an adapter, just like what I use for this for this phone, to use wired headphones, or you get a phone which has already a 3.5 millimeter jack. But getting beyond the point from that, what's the most relevant is that initially, before Apple got rid of the headphone jack, mm, for a while, there used to be a company whose name I sadly can't remember right now, but if there was a company which had essentially point of sale devices, so POS is just like the ones everybody sees in a supermarket or a hypermarket or wherever you do your shopping. But those POSs could actually be run simply off the 3.5 millimeter jack. And while those ran on a different network, so it was a different payment processor than the traditional ones that we know. So that would be Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discovery, and well, other smaller ones and regional ones, which we won't take into consideration for the sake of this argument. Who knows if maybe Visa had something to do into this? It's most likely a possibility, since that's also the moment when Apple Pay started becoming a thing more and more. While it did take some while for the merchants to adopt the possibility to pay with Apple Pay. Well, just like with Google Pay, well, the kinks got sorted out during the times from its implementation up until they got adopted en masse to the level that we have it today. But see, this is exactly the issue right here. So when you have to some extent, okay, dominant players in an industry have always existed in one way or another. And with the world getting more digitalized and everybody swiping cards instead of carrying cash and doing all sorts of other similar things, well, what a surprise! Whoever has essentially stolen the start in digitalization, and whoever is sort of financing these pushes towards making more digital payments, to make more card payments, to do more digital management of money. And of course, it's not that these payment processors work alone. You must first have an account at a bank in order to have a card. And the card generally for debit cards, you have either a version of Visa or MasterCard. Even the sub-brands of MasterCard. So here we take into consideration Maestro and whoever still uses them, who I think they definitely are below the age of 18. Cirrus cards. So it was CIRRUS. Those used to also be a thing. You could only just you don't just have it on you and put it into an ATM and take money out of it. That was everything that you could have done with Cirrus. So herein lies the issue. We as people are also at fault for this because it's not like if we didn't use the cards, regardless if they are debit or credit cards, because they are issued by almost the same companies. Uh, but Visa altogether, it being the bigger one, of course that it holds a dominant position and it starts doing dominant position stuff. And in doing the dominant position stuff, there's also this part of whether you're squashing your competition or any potential competition up until pro and see here it follows a cycle which we have seen in history with gigantic companies that essentially just dominate the market and there is no realistic competition at all. Well, with the bare few exceptions, the story turned out different for them. But while to some extent, it does have some benefits towards the consumers who are also the ones that prop up the system. Take, for example, when Standard Oil used to be in the USD oil state company, one of the consequences of that was that suddenly the prices of petroleum products, not suddenly, but over time, prices of petroleum products became really, really, really affordable the, because the founder really managed to use the economies of scale and the entire financial horsepower of his empire to push a cheaper product. It's not always the case like that. In plenty of cases, whoever holds a sort of natural monopoly starts squeezing the consumers. Um, Even then, the part of squeezing the consumers sooner later than sooner than later, it always tends to happen, and that's the moment when things get so bad at some point, where so real competition will appear at one point, and be sure that no dominance over any market is eternal. And to some extent, I would even say that indications of monopoly breakups in history, so evidences such as the Standard Oil example that I used earlier, because it got broken up into four companies because the government had an issue with it. It had the ironic effect of making Rockefeller much richer than he used to be owning a single company. So, to some extent, we have to look into this in a way that, from a business point of view, earning yourself an antitrust lawsuit from any government, but especially a large government where you have your business founded, in this case, the U.S. When it comes to Visa, that's actually a sign of great success. You've been so successful in your business and in dominating your market sector, so that the government has started getting involved into somewhat slowing you down and limiting your practices. Well, indeed, it definitely affects. So Mary Garland is right when he's mentioning that Visa squeezing the market and having deals with absolutely every bank under the sun to issue cards under their payment processing system is definitely affecting everybody else. But here's the other side of this double-edged sword. To some extent, it benefits us, the people who would use bank cards. But on the other side, it doesn't benefit you because now you're getting squeezed. Now you're getting squeezed, and while you may not see it, because it's not it depends here on the bank. how much do they charge per each transaction. But in general, when you use a national card in the country where it has been issued, there are instances when strictly speaking here about debit cards here, because that's the discussion at hand. So you use a card, and if you pay at a POS, you will definitely see that the sum of money that you paid, well, for whatever stuff you bought, is the sum of money that appears on the POS and the sum of money that you pay. But it's not just that behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, and behind this digitalization of purchases, there are a lot of interest, just like everywhere else, especially when it comes to transacting money. You definitely have gigantic interests, which represent quite a lot of zeros behind them. But as I was saying, so in order to provide you, or for a merchant to provide you with the convenience to pay physically with a card, first you got to take into consideration, well, first of all, you need to buy a point of sale system, a POS. That can cost anywhere between, depending on what model you want to get. And there are many companies who make these. You can spend anywhere between £100 all the way to £500 for a POS system. It depends. It depends what sort of features do you want it. It depends also how techy do you want it. It also depends on what security features has it got. But in general, that's already the starting price. So it's already not cheap to buy POS, and the POS is just something that does that and nothing else. Then from this moment on, it's not just that. So you already bought yourself a POS. Now you need to register it with the bank so that you can receive the payments. But then herein lies the issue. The merchant is the one that almost always pays for the transaction fees when you pay with a POS. If you've ever seen places where it says that you have minimum limits, minimum spending limits, up until only over that sum of money, you can pay by card. Now you understand why. And the reason is that below a certain sum of money, depending on the merchant that we're talking about, the fees themselves are so large that it simply just doesn't justify. It simply doesn't justify allowing customers to pay that, because well, when you when you start to but when you start to draw the line and do the calculations, it simply isn't worth it to accept payments below a certain sum of money. So, as far as I know, the best examples I know that I know are in Romania. So, for example, if you have a POS and you tie the POS is tied with ING Bank, which is, yes, a Dutch bank, but here I'm talking about the Romanian branch of the bank. Well, it's only the bank that gets 10% out of every transaction as a fee. So imagine, no, it doesn't matter if you pay £5, or if you pay £500 or £500,000, the bank always takes 10%. And if by any chance the transaction doesn't uh, that doesn't reach certain limits, certain lower limits, they will also ask for a fixed fee as well per transaction. And in some cases, in some cases, I'm not sure what the other competitor of ING Bank, so here I'm referring to Banca Transilvania, what policy they are practicing. But it's either a system of either the bank is asking a percentage of the transaction plus, or they have a fixed sum of money and another percentage as well. And generally, well, from that percentage, yes, it's the bank's responsibility to pay the processing fees as well, because while Visa is the payment processor, or MasterCard or American Express, well, the issuing authority is not Visa. The Visa just puts the stamp on the cards, but the cards are made by the bank or by the company that is contracted by the bank to make the cards in order for you to have them and use them. So they bear the responsibility of paying those processing fees, with a few exceptions. But here we're referring to the usage case scenario of the vast majority of people, this happens to be the case. So once you know these things and make sure that uh, it's uh, it's the same more or less everywhere, especially in the highly digitalized countries where we no longer use the ancient concepts like having cash on you and stuff like that. In this, here in this case, yes, even when Visa does things such as these, and when a lot of people adopt more cards and use more and do more card payments everywhere else, obviously that the prices are going to increase because you suddenly have an overhead that in order to provide the convenience, you also have to spend some money to provide that convenience to your clients. But then over time, you realize that the payment processor and the bank that's using the payment processor, they're essentially screwing you over out of your money for providing that convenience. And been plenty of scenarios, especially when it comes to small merchants. The small merchants tend to be the most screwed by this. That's also another aspect to take into consideration, simply because well, it's much more difficult for a small merchant. Say, for example, if I operate a stall at a flea market and I would use a POS. Simply because there are so many people that walk with cards around, it wouldn't exactly do me any good to force them to pay the stuff by cash, at least uh, at least up to a certain sum of money. Well, simply because you would lose a lot on the when it comes to potential clientele for the stall that I will be operating. And so the circumstances do force me to choose to get a POS in order to access the bunch of clientele that's walking with cards in their pockets instead of cash. And so I would at least offer some sense of security to the business and the stall that I'm operating. However, here exactly is the compromise. The compromise is that when everybody adopts cards, and then we rely on banks, and then we rely on the payment processors, which are contracted by the banks, or more like the payment processors are paying big sums of money in order to get exclusivity agreements with banks. Or say for example, Revolut as well. So from the very beginning, Revolut in the UK offered cards whose payment processor was Visa, and they also did that for a while in continental Europe. But then once Revolut moved to Lithuania and they also moved the bank accounts to Lithuania, suddenly it will no longer issue any more Visa cards for Europe, with a few exceptions. But generally, the basic debit cards are not Visa, they're MasterCard. And this is a difference that I've observed as well, because as I use Revolut as well, because simply because other banks in the UK are just too expensive and too demanding and too slow to operate. Mm, well, simple procedures, not to mention the gigantic fees that they have, which Revolut doesn't. Speaking here of the changing context of a business. So when the vast majority of people start using these, of course the prices will get higher because it's logical to the merchant that everybody will do this. So well, here we have these extra costs in order to provide the convenience. Well, we provide the convenience to the customers. Might as well the customers could also pay for that convenience. So automatically you raise up some the you raise the prices in order to account for those extra costs that you are incurring because you're providing the convenience. The dishonest part of this situation is that when you raise the price on everybody, whether they are card users or cash users, the price raise is the same. And while yes, you could in theory put a price or put a price for cash users and put a different price for card users, or simply offer a discount, which I've seen some businesses doing this. If you pay a bill using cash instead of using a card, I've seen plenty of cases of businesses that offer a certain percentage of discount. Sometimes it's 5%, sometimes it's 10%. But here, this is definitely not standard practice. And currently the status quo still remains. So yeah, people running with cars around. And here I'm talking about the status quo in our side of the world. So North America, UK, Europe, and other so-called first world countries, and even some countries which are not part of the first world who really went all in on this digitalization effort. Take, for example, the oil kingdoms of the Middle East. Well, those also fall into this category, but here, let's be honest, I would somehow have slightly more trust, with a grain of salt, I'm saying this, in the banks in the Middle East, not exactly screwing over the consumers as much as commercial banks do in the West, because the banks also, even the commercial banks, so the private banks which are not Islamic, so who do not run on the laws regarding Islamic finance and Islamic banking, even those do not screw their consumers that much in order to raise the prices, well, in order to have absurd fees when people pay by cards or other things like that. And if they do it only temporarily. So it's not you're not exactly squeezing the merchants dry or forcing the merchants to get your stuff, or to get your POS, or to actually tie the bank account, to tie the POS to the bank account, to provide this convenience. At least as far as I know, that tends to not happen. Amazingly enough, considering how much money is circulating in the West, so the sort of collective West, like some KGB guy likes to say about this part of the world, considering how much money is circulating around, banking costs are surprisingly expensive. Not to mention the banking legislation climate, especially after, well, okay, especially after 2008, and in Europe after 2012, when the Basel rules came in, started getting drafted, and then gradually came into force. Well, can you imagine? Ju- just just how much established businesses have already gotten so entrenched and so fit in the entire system that it would be difficult to penetrate it somehow. But see, getting back to what I was saying at the very beginning, if Apple or other companies would not have screwed the consumers by removing certain stuff that would have made other businesses who threaten much bigger businesses, if they would have made them more viable, we may not have had the discussion right now. And at the same time, we can also not get rid of these payment processors despite the shit that they're doing. Because if we were to, then if you, then whatever you consider the Great Reset, it will look completely different if these companies were to vanish with the current habits of the population. And if you want a perfect evidence of how a world without, well, where you have digital payments but you don't have any payment processors, any trustworthy payment processors, here's also a major aspect. One of the reasons why these four companies are essentially used is simply because they also have the trust, and whatever happened, not only that their system is safe, but you know that whatever sum of money is getting paid, say for example, I have a bank account in the UK and I go to Australia. to pay something with my card, which is issued by a UK bank. Well, Visa has sufficient trust, and these four companies have sufficient trust in making sure that when I pay with a card something in Australia, in a few seconds, that information is relayed for the payment processor, so it goes all the way from the merchant in Australia, confirming all the way to the bank in the UK, which first checks if I have sufficient money, which also checks but this is not the case because there is currency, but it also does is check that if there is sufficient currency in order to do the transaction, and only then it does the wiring of the money from the bank account held in the UK all the way to the merchant in Australia. This is what we can do today, and from some perspective, it really is amazing that we can do this. But on the other side, let's look at the alternative. As I was mentioning earlier, when you have digital payments, or if you have digital currency, but you don't have any established or any reputable, trustworthy payment processor whatsoever, you look at cryptocurrency. Oh boy, yes. If everybody who has done payments in cryptocurrency, which is not a direct transfer from one person to another, knows how absolutely shit this is. And here I'm talking about what was it? So not only ever since cryptocurrency existed, there have been different payment processors which went down under because they were simply just awful. Or take for example Mt. Gox. Mt. Gox is a really shining example of just how awful things were, and also how desperate the situation was. Uh, you can have all the Bitcoin in the world, but if you don't have a way to transfer them into the world, except by doing complex calculations based on the floating price of the Bitcoin in that moment when you're doing the transaction, and also making sure that you know the wallet that of the person or the company that you're selling it to is the right one. Do you if what I was saying earlier with the around 10% transaction fees that are taken by the bank to also cover their own costs, but also cover the payment processing costs. If you think that is a lot, be mindful that in cryptocurrency payment processing, there have been fees anywhere between 40 to 78% of the initial sum of money that were demanded for those payments in order to be processed at a certain time. And this was just a few years ago. I'm not exactly sure what the situation is right now, but I'm just saying that this wouldn't be the alternative if these companies would not have existed. And these companies exist partly thanks to us, but partly despite us, because they also have their own aims. So it remains to be seen what will come out of this antitrust lawsuit. It will still take quite a lot of years for this to be settled. But now you see the situation. Now you understand it. Why it's a big deal, and it's more like it's not as much where Visa has monopolized the market by a long shot, but it's also because it realistically doesn't have much competition. So your only competition is realistically MasterCard and Discovery. And Discovery, I fail to remember a place which accepted Discovery cards altogether, maybe because I certainly don't. So I certainly don't remember a place has accepted Discovery cards and hasn't. That has been probably in 2007, 2008 when I saw it last time. And of course, American Express, we don't talk about those because American Express, well, it is a payment processing business. It's also a business that operates as its own bank, as its own credit issuing facility. Mm, it's much more complicated when it comes to American Express, and also American Express is not something for the average person. Okay, average person here, I'm not talking about middle class Americans, but say for example, I've only known quite a handful of people who had American Express cards, and even less of those handful of people who could actually use them to could actually use the cards. to the proper advantage. And even American Express as a business, as a concept, so not only in a lot of places they no longer accept American Express cards altogether, but there's also that other part where simply simply this cannot do any competition to the larger ones because the American Express won't get into what these guys are operating into. So in order to issue their own cards and to do deals with the banks and to have their own debit facilities and debit payments processing, it won't do that. So this is more like the more the concerning thing is not that Visa has been doing what it has been doing and what everybody expected that any monopolistic business would be doing, but it's also the part where where it has been squashing potential competition at every level, and which is also it's the way Visa operates is something surprisingly similar to how Oracle operates. But at least when it comes to Oracle and their database management systems, at least you have alternatives to Oracle. Nobody forces you to rely on Oracle for database management, and there's always a possibility to make your own if you're that determined and you're that spiteful towards any established business similar to Oracle, or if it's Oracle itself. But when it comes to money, unfortunately, the discussion changes quite a lot because unless you have a gigantic domestic market that you as a payment processor can live off to, say if you are and the reason why I say a single country is that this cannot apply to things like the European Union, because in the European Union every country has its own banking laws and compliance costs would be astronomical. But say that if you are a payment processor and you want to open up as a competition to Visa, Mastercard, and these ones in your own country, then you need to live in a big enough country first of all to to actually have a clientele. So here I'm thinking, well, the domestic USA would be one. The UK could also have one because it has sufficient population. And here, of course, the larger countries which have populations past 40, 50 million people, and the bigger the population and the more digitalized the economy, so to speak, the better odds you would have to create a real competition to these payment processors. So bigger countries like India, China. Well, China already has their own payment processing system, and I'm pretty sure India has its own payment processors who are not specifically Visa, Mastercard, or Discovery. In only in those scenarios you can at least start and tend to a potential competition these payment processors, and already when you're at least a dominant force on your own domestic market, that's the moment when you can provide real competition to other against other payment processors as well, because it's not like they don't exist these days. Here it also matters. It also matters what's the regulatory climate. So, say for example, well, people will be more inclined to trust a payment processor from India than they will be inclined to trust a payment processor from Nigeria. Nigeria being that country where the Nigerian prince scam, but I think it may be a scam that's older than me, and I'm not particularly young either. So overall, this is what could be done, but this is how the situation stands. We are at fault for this as well. Those of us who use cards and who use cards for anything else except going to the ATM and pull out money in order to spend that cash later on. This situation may not change anytime soon, and as usual, I don't think that if the government gets involved and if this lawsuit would actually would actually be successful, and so Visa would break up. God forbid if Visa gets broken up the way Standard Oil got broken up, or if say the federal government orders Visa to break up in order to comply with anti-monopoly regulations. Well, there's things will get pretty messy in that moment, and it will start first in the U.S. if the things will finalize in that sort of way. Moving on now to the USA again, but this time politically. This is an op-ed which I found really interesting and definitely worth a discussion about. Blaze Media: How Soros-funded judges undermine GOP legislatures in red states. If conservatives don't address the problem of the state judiciary, electing the best state legislators in primaries will be an exercise in futility. The conservative movement has finally created a structural vetting process to ensure that every judicial vacancy under a Republican president is filled with at least a moderately conservative judge. However, despite this progress, many left-leaning judges remain in the federal judiciary due to the presidency switching between parties. But what about states where Republicans consistently control the government? Shouldn't those states be filled with conservative judges like in Florida? Unfortunately, no. Unless several red states make changes, an oligarchy of liberal judges could undermine all efforts to expand Freedom Caucus majorities. At the federal level, all three layers of the judiciary are appointed through presidential nomination without restrictions on the pool of nominees and confirmed by the Senate. New Hampshire is the only red state with a similar process for appointing Supreme Court judges, where the governor can nominate anyone of his choosing, subject to confirmation by the Executive Council, a unique quasi-legislative body. In 5 other red-ish states, Alabama, Louisiana, North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas, state Supreme Court judges are selected through direct partisan elections. While this gives Republicans a partisan edge, it doesn't necessarily guarantee the election of strong conservatives. For states in these first two categories, conservatives need to build a network of solid conservative-only candidates in both gubernatorial appointments and for supporting elections. The most problematic states, however, are those that select judges through non-partisan elections. These elections allow undercover Democrats to enter office stealthily. Even worse are the states that use assisted appointments, where a commission, often controlled by left-leaning bar associations, limits the governor's choices by presenting a small list of candidates. In several red states, unelected commissions in which the majority of members aren't selected by the Republican governor dominate the judicial selection process. These include Alaska, Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and Wyoming. It should come as no surprise that we have a major problem with liberal judges in those states. Only 4 current red states using commissions allow the governor either to ignore the recommendations or to appoint the majority of the commission members: Florida, Tennessee, Iowa, and Utah. Unfortunately, because of liberal Republican governors over the years in states like Tennessee and Utah, these states are dominated by liberal judges just as bad as any in states controlled by Democrats. Tennessee and Utah have recently introduced legislative confirmation for judges, and a new conservative Utah governor could theoretically ignore the commission's recommendations, unlike in other states. In Iowa, however, a strong majority of the commission, 8 of the 17 commissioners, are elected by unelected lawyers. Only in Florida does the governor select all the commissioners. Then, of course, there are solid red states that hold nonpartisan elections. These include Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, Mississippi, Montana, North Dakota, and West Virginia. For trial courts, even more red states, including Oklahoma, Ohio, South Dakota, and Florida, choose judges through nonpartisan contests. South Carolina is an unusual state where the legislature has sole authority over judicial selection. In short, aside from the issue of liberal governors or legislatures, most red states still choose judges either through nonpartisan elections or by placing governors on a short leash, controlled by commissions dominated by bar associations, unaccountable bureaucrats, technocrats, or lawyers. Montana is one state where the influence of nonpartisan elections has been evident. Nearly every good policy passed by the legislature has been struck down by the courts. These include rulings against an abortion parental consent law, a provision defining sex as male and female, and various election integrity measures. Two Liberal Supreme Court justices, Chief Justice Mike McGrath and Justice Dick Sandefur, who voted against parental consent, are retiring. Corey Swanson and Dan Wilson are better candidates to replace them. Due to the non-partisan labeling of candidates, however, voters are often confused about which candidate is a Republican. As a result, they are frequently swayed by slick ads from well-funded liberals who do not run openly as Democrats. A partisan election would ensure that a Democrat could not win and would also make primaries partisan in a way that could net more conservative Republicans. North Carolina recently switched to partisan elections, and not surprisingly, Republicans now have a 6-to-1 edge on the state's highest court. You can imagine the results in 20 or so states where Democrats are much less viable statewide than they are in the Tar Heel state. Red states need partisan elections to address incumbent judges running for re-election. Most states currently use retention ballots or nonpartisan elections. Only Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Ohio, and North Carolina hold regular partisan elections for Supreme or Appellate Court judges. Indiana holds partisan elections for additional terms of trial judges. Every other state uses retention ballots, nonpartisan elections, or a selection process for nomination. Red states should require liberal judges to stand for re-election under partisan labels so that voters know who they are voting for. It's clear that voters in red states will avoid candidates labeled as Democrats. This is why the left cannot push its agenda for representative democracy in these states. Instead, they rely on nonpartisan selection commissions, nonpartisan labels, or confusing ballot initiatives. In fact, the left is pushing ballot initiatives to circumvent legislatures and implement its agenda. And when those initiatives are challenged in court, red state liberal judges side with the left every single time. State judges in Missouri and Nebraska recently allowed vague abortion amendments to remain on the ballot. In North Dakota, a state court overruled a legislature, nullifying the state's pro-life law. Meanwhile, in Utah, where conservatives sought to pass a ballot initiative empowering the legislature to regulate the effects of ballot initiatives, the judiciary took a different approach. Utah's third district court judge Deanna Gibson blocked Amendment D, calling it false and misleading. This judicial action contrasts with decisions in other states where vague ballot initiatives have been allowed on the November ballot. Here, the judiciary's role has been to empower direct democracy as a way to bypass representative democracy, the governance model our founders designed. Several decades ago, George Soros recognized the power of targeting local judges, prosecutors, city councils, and ballot initiatives. By focusing on these areas, he gained significant influence across all 50 states. This strategy has proven largely successful. If conservatives don't address the problem of the red state judiciary, electing the best state legislators in the primaries will be an exercise in futility. Well, leaving aside here, well, the way the country functions, the country known as the USA, well, the author Horowitz, he is right when it comes to this, and even though it's up to every state how it wants to well operate internal elections, as underwritten by the Bill of Rights. Well, he definitely makes quite a few good points here, and this also outlines the fact again that the Republicans are definitely not doing enough, and they keep on avoiding as much as possible this detail of the long march for institutions. If you want to take the institutions back that the leftists took from you, you first have to entrench the system that you already have if it's functioning. See for example, the case with the state of Florida. Or if you aren't at that level, in order to first start entrenching on what you already have, well, it's time for you to work towards that direction, and pretty much this is what needs to be done by the Republicans. And even though as much as they don't like it, and as much as they have the biggest tendency to discuss about how the conservatives and they are above the propaganda because we represent a different set of values than those guys represent. It's definitely that's not sufficient. That doesn't get you votes. It doesn't get you votes, and you're already fighting a losing battle. So when you're facing a battle against the fire with only a water pistol, then that exactly isn't doing much. It's just we can't. Well, if you want to have real success, you can't go, well, that's as much as we could have done. And so the Republicans, as much as they don't like to, they also need to foster their own sort of activist class within the party. And it's not just with the Republicans, but it's with the conservatives in general. Well, okay, the UK, the US does have some institutions. The think tanks like the Cato Institute and many other good examples, but those are still too few and far between. And okay, you can have these, well, and it's good because some countries either simply don't have it, or whatever they have falls into deaf ears. But overall, you if you want to win the ground that you lost against them, you must at least take in consideration what they're doing good. And the reason why the leftists have gotten this point is that well, they've gotten good at activism and being loud and being vocal and being visible, and at the same time also disseminating these things and these ideas to the bottom rung, to the average people, which is also the same thing that the conservatives did. The conservatives do have this inherent benefit that they do not have to spend that much time and money into trying to convince a person. Well, why, for example, abortion may not be a good thing. Um, while when it comes to the leftists, the leftists have gotten to this point of diseconomies of scale when it comes to their policy. Well, I use the term diseconomies of scale because I don't have a better one to define what they're doing. And the more insane the things that they push are, the more expensive does it get to actually convince the population that it's normal. Take, for example, back in Ireland several years ago when the abortion bill got passed. Well, the abortion bill got passed, but the first instance when all sorts of NGOs, including Soros, but also many others, invested some billions of euros in that campaign, only to fail. And when the campaign failed, they went back. They learned from their mistakes. They invested a new sum of money, which is larger than what it used to be, in the first attempt, and the second time it succeeded. But the rationale is, why has it succeeded? I wonder. It's not because sure, there are also other reasons that we can get to when it comes to discussing about the Irish society, if we are to stick with this example. But overall, it's not like the majority of the population was for it. It just happened to be that a sufficient majority of the voting population, which is not the same as the population altogether, they voted and they got rallied and they got convinced that yes, this is the cause to work towards. And yes, okay, you have quite a handful of useful idiots who do essentially the work for free when it comes to disseminating propaganda and convincing people on the ground. But even those have their own purposes because they have circles of friends, they have a sort of exposure, whether it is in real life or in whether it is on the internet, and their opinion, and if that opinion gets distributed to other people, then you start generating a sort of echo chamber where, or more like, not like an echo chamber, but the opinions within social circles start reverberating, and it's always one that, whether willingly or unwillingly, start something, and then you see it. The more it gets discussed, the more it becomes an idea in other people's minds who may be undecided on that specific topic. But then you have then you have also the well, the more competent people whose only responsibility is to write policy papers, who also have and then another group of people have the responsibility of marketing those ideas to the population or to whatever interest groups which are required in order to push for their policy. The Republicans and conservatives need to do the same, and so far they still aren't doing it. Or and wherever they are doing it, well, okay, they're doing it too slow. Well, let's hope that they're doing it too slow right now, but with the changes in the generations, well, things hopefully are getting better. But on the other side, that's also another thing that I'm personally not too sure of, because polarization really is a thing, and polarization has only gotten worse over the years. Well, we can discuss now about how people were so visibly polarized back in 2016 when Trump got elected. But then polarization really took a jump during the pandemic, because in a lot of countries, governments of all sorts of political leanings and colors implemented restrictive measures against the population in order to control them. And and of course, that didn't exactly stand well for a lot of people. A lot of people have had issues with that sudden shake-up of not only the societal norms, but also societal habits of that population, but also of the individuals who still make up that society. And so that's why we see things as being more and more and more hysterical. And so polarization went both directions. So of course the rate of radicalism definitely is higher on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, but radicalism has also gotten into being a thing amongst the conservatives as well. And while some of it is good, but a bunch of it, when you're radical on something, you end up at one point being blind. And while on several issues, on several politically sensitive issues, it's definitely good to have a standing position because you know that you're right and you have all the evidence required to know that you're right. But while you recognize the context and you see that it may not be the right moment currently uh, to push for what you know that is best, and what you know that what you know that that's how the things have been done, especially when it comes to conservatives. It may it may not be the time because the other forces that are working against you are too big, but you know that at some point your idea would win, because that idea is the more normal and the more digestible to people. Well, and see, this is since I've approached this topic regarding abortion. We'll see for the clearest case of polarization was the hysteria when the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, and we all remember the stories around that, uh, where uh, where apparently now abortion will become federally illegal or other bullshit like that, when the reality was that the responsibility of legislating such things has moved from the federal government to the state government, so as it should have always been done, as it how it was used to be done up until the Roe v. Wade case went to the Supreme Court. But hey, that's this is the good example uh, that I can provide, and how much hysteria was there about that? And, and even then, on the conservative side of people, you also have a bunch of people who recognize that abortion sometimes is a necessary evil, and for whoever wants to get to it, as long as they know what the risks are involved, but also at the same time, as long as it's a common decision. Here I'm referring to it from a couple's perspective. Yes, from an individual perspective, considering the situation in this country that I continue to live in, if I am to get into this topic, I may have issues with the law. Say, for example, that a certain gender of the population, in about 76.7% of the cases, if we are to trust the statistics, they take this procedure as an elective procedure, and they don't do it because actually something bad has happened. Make of that what you wish. I can't say more about this without risking getting my door blown up. But getting back to the topic being discussed, well, Horowitz is definitely right. When are the Republicans going to up the ante on, first of all, marching for the institutions with their own people, also forming those people in order to be part of those institutions and do conservative things and actually conserve the traditions and the values. We don't know. Remains to be seen. Elections in the US are not far off, and in that moment, we will see what will happen. Moving on now. Speaking of using Ireland as a mention, Reuters. Ireland drops plans for hate speech law, minister says. Ireland will not introduce hate speech laws, its Justice Minister said on Saturday, dropping a central part of the response to riots in Dublin last year following criticism from some government lawmakers, opponents, and billionaire Elon Musk. The government first brought the proposed legislation before Parliament 2 years ago and further prioritized tightening anti-hate laws it said were unfit for the social media age last November after the unprecedented night of rioting in Dublin. The plans have since drawn increased criticism from within government, and Justice Minister Helen McEntee said she would remove the incitement to hatred proposals and proceed only with the parts of the legislation that deal with hate crime. I believe existing incitement to hatred legislation needs to be strengthened. However, we need a consensus to do that, and we currently don't have that, McEntee told national broadcaster RTE. The Irish Times first reported the news on Saturday. Ex-owner Musk said earlier this year that his social media would fund any Irish legal challenges to the hate speech legislation. Since we've gotten into these sort of topics, and I've gotten into these sort of topics in the past, may I reiterate this point, and especially as the socio-political climate has changed in the UK, be sure that this will be discussed in the podcast as well. I will resort to what the communists, especially the Romanian communists, used to call the limbaj de lemn, which will be translated colloquially into wooden language. And wooden language, you've probably definitely heard it over this podcast. Whenever I use the term, for example, cohabiting people, to refer to a certain sector of the population, which you know what sort of culture they belong to and what sort of ideas they have and what sort of things that they do. Okay, not all of them, but sufficient enough to be of a valid concern. You know who I will be referring to. Now, when it comes to this article and the reason why I put it, it's that protests work. Reuters is definitely not providing sufficient context when it comes to what happened in Ireland, and it's not that protests have been running in from the last year, but there have also been a lot of protests this year as well, especially during the spring, and the reasons were legitimate. You had a lot of things which shouldn't have done, which shouldn't have happened. First of all, And here I appeal to the normality. When you get people who have absolutely no sort of paperwork in the country, and God knows how they got here, while at the same time the bureaucrats and also special interest groups which do stand on making money from these sort of deals with ping-ponging the economic migrants that come both in the UK but also in Ireland as well and many other countries. It's Here's a situation where you get to, and with these people to integrate them is a difficult job because the reason why they come here is not to integrate, it's to suck off the welfare as much as possible. And this has been a case for decades, but starting from 2015, 2016, it's more apparent than ever. And statistics from everywhere mention this. Say, for example, Germany has, as far as I know, the best statistics. Um, Apparently, the immigrants from a foreign background that came to the country, but they also don't take in consideration the immigrants that come from the EU. About 80% of them, or something like that, are still on welfare after so long. And okay, that welfare comes with some conditions, like for example, obligating you to go to a language school in order to learn the language of the place. Take for example, in there's when it comes to Germany, they force you to go to a language school in order to learn German. Uh, but This is what happened in Ireland is a sign that protests do work. And be sure that whoever has seen the protests that were in Ireland from last year, but especially the ones from this year as well, all protests were started on legitimate grounds, mind you. And yes, a lot of people, plenty of people ended up getting imprisoned for the fact that they were at these protests. First, they started in Ireland, and then you had these other protests, which were on almost the same, almost for the same reasons in the UK as well. Well, at least in Ireland, the legislation, at least part of it, is getting pushed back, and it's getting pushed back because the political class, no, even if they are mm, brainwashed into believing the leftist ideas, and they're definitely getting paid a lot to also push these leftist ideals into legislation. At the same time, they're also looking at the end of the day. Well, if okay, we may end up getting paid this much money in order to, we have these many favors with God knows what NGOs. But in the end, will these be sufficient in order for us to get re-elected? Speaking here of the previous article, the previous op-ed written by Horowitz, and what the Republicans aren't doing and what they should do. Well, even when it comes to any political party, especially those in power, when you are already in power, power in itself is a corrosive thing, which is why, with a bare few exceptions, over the course of history, almost every political party which is in power experiences this corrosion in power, and that's simply the way things are. But protests do work. And even if the system is against you, it doesn't change the factual basis of reality that the things that are happening and the reasons why these protests have begun, they're completely abnormal. They're completely abnormal, and when you have people dying over it, and especially when it comes to not just people but also kids in a lot of cases. It's definitely been the case in Ireland, which is why the situation has gotten out of hand to the level that the Garda, the police, started stomping into the ground the protesters. The protesters having at the end legitimate concerns. What sort of country are you? The one which cannot control its borders, where you accept absolutely everybody, and then when it comes to getting rid of those people which shouldn't have been there at the very beginning, it's an entire bureaucratic clusterfuck, which is also full of loopholes. Those loopholes which have been put already in place by special interest groups and NGOs already before that. And if any government tries to sidestep the so-called system that has been implemented, you start having all sorts of weird events. See, even if in the case of Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister of the UK, as of July 2024, when he was the one that tried to push forward the plan of deporting the immigrants to Rwanda, well, who what were the first institutions that went up in arms when that information became public? Well, they were all the human rights and all the refugees, ass kissers, who started filing lawsuits, writing letters. And some lawsuits have been even filed to the European Court of Human Rights, and that's not something that everybody can do. It, um, okay, it's definitely easier than it used to be, but as usual, when it comes to European law and when it comes to human rights, in, there are plenty of cases where you need specialized lawyers in order to file these lawsuits for you, in order to draw up the lawsuit properly for you to actually get the best chances for a win in at the European Court of Human Rights. And when you have hundreds of thousands of individuals per year who are pretty much in the same situation, and they're essentially used as pawns by the special interest groups and the NGOs, in which, yes, some could you could say that they are indeed evil and they do follow an agenda, but on the other side, the rest are just brainwashed, useful idiots who also try to self-perpetuate their NGO and their grifting, because it's all in the end it's all about money. And when it comes to Ireland and the UK, one of the big special interest groups into this entire debacle are the hotel businesses, and also the local councils themselves. Where do you think that all these economic migrants are being put into? They're being put in other places. They're not being put into houses because there aren't enough houses for the population that already lives here. That's the reason why you have gigantic these gigantic prices on housing in the UK and Ireland, or that's why you have the ginormous fees. It's simply because, well, first of all, the economic migrants have been put into local councils' housing, but while that became full as well, there were way too many, and they have been put someplace else. So that's where the hotels came to, because hotels are made fundamentally under that idea. Well, we are a building where we can house temporarily a bunch of people for as much time as they want to, depending on whatever interests that there may be in the area. Whether you have tourist hotels for certain cities or certain sightseeing spots or certain tourist areas, or then you also have lodges or travelers hotels or motels, such as the motels that you see on the side of the motorway, or take for example the hotels that you see generally around airports. People who are transferring, or employees of airport or airline companies that stay there, because, well, you can't exactly expect them to sleep on the floor for 8 to 10 hours up until they have to fly the next morning, or whether they have to work on a flight the next morning. those are the ones that were approached in the moment that almost all the places within the local council's housing schemes filled up, and make sure that they're being paid really generous sums of money simply because they're doing this very simple thought process. Well, the government comes to me in order to house these people. At the end of the time, I'm in the business of making money, no matter and definitely housing more people and the government paying for them. So it means that I do not run the headache of having to do my own process for every individual that wants to stay in my hotel. There are definitely cases where plenty of where definitely the money is not only bigger as a sum of as per individual, but also bigger as an entire share, depending on how many people how many economic migrants you're housing into that hotel or that hotel chain of yours. It's overall more lucrative than it is to operate the hotel business as normal, because the government, when it comes to economic migrants, needs to house a lot of people. And even if, yes, I know, and there are plenty of people who watch this podcast know what sort of people these ones that come in the UK and Ireland are, and also in other countries in Western Europe. And they're not exactly the cleanest ones, they're not exactly the most civilized ones, and they're not exactly the most caring of ones. But even then, even if you draw the line at the end of the day, having to account for the inevitable damages and renovation costs to the rooms, this has been happening for a while, and we can surely say that for the hotels businesses and whoever operates lodging, which can be and has been contracted by the government to house these economic migrants, more, all this housing being paid out of the taxpayers' money, they deserve whatever is happening to them. And what we can see so far that if the conditions would have been disadvantageous, the hotels would have pulled out of the scheme, or out of schemes like these. But they haven't. They haven't, and they haven't for so many years. So the only logical conclusion that we can get to is that it works. But while it works, here I make an appeal to the average people. Where exactly are you? If you have in the proximity a hotel or a lodging or something similar where you have a bunch of these migrants staying, and those migrants are also not kept in a closed off area as other more sane countries do, take for example Romania and Hungary. What exactly are you doing as an individual? Don't you know that that said hotel also has an owner, also has its own employees, also has its own contact details, and then you can simply write to them. Well, I'm this guy that lives on this street within close proximity to your business, and no, I'm having huge issues. Write something like I'm having huge issues with the fact that you chose to house migrants, and the migrants are generating in the proximity of your establishment a really unsafe environment for the people living and working there. Right, something sentimental, like I can no longer take my daughter out in the evenings because from your establishment there are always the drunk migrants or loud migrants or really suspicious or dangerous migrants that potentially dangerous migrants that may come out. And so in this case, you can at least appeal to the emotion and maybe get some sort of at least some sort of answer from these establishments, and let alone if you're not the only one affected, and you're definitely not the only one affected, then why can't you discuss this with your fellow residents, the people that live in the same area, and then discuss with them. Well, you see, this has been happening for a while, and overall, since we've been here and since this situation, we feel more unsafe. We have increased costs because of whatever potential damages that said economic migrants may do, Not to mention the I mentioned with an unsafe environment, you also have decreasing businesses. So either the businesses that already will be experiencing a downturn in business and in income, and then later on you won't have any new businesses that may come by. Because businesses don't want to be put in an unsafe area. You're not exactly going to build a bank office where you hold also physical money in the middle of a ghetto. Unless in the middle of that ghetto you have automated turrets, private guards, uh, sturdy iron bars at the window, and about 3 to 4 checkpoints inside the bank. But even those are expensive in themselves. Well, who employs all those security employees? How much does security infrastructure cost to do that? That's definitely not a solution. The solution would be a much simpler one. Well, how about we start treating crime as it is? And we have this penal law for a very good reason, and then we also have this government monopoly on violence, which is called the police, whose responsibility, as far as I remember last time, was to provide a safe environment on the streets by cleaning up the streets of these sort of people. But what do I know? What do I know? Now, since we mentioned the change in the regime in the UK, on to the Marxian. Keep the faith, Starmer urges as he vows to rebuild a new Britain. Well, can't wait to see what a prosecutor has when it comes to ideas on how to rebuild this country, which is very obviously on its downslide. Prime Minister tells Labour conference that he will not con people with false hope, but says difficult trade-offs will help bring national renewal. Britain has become a country of pride, wealth and stability can become a country of pride, wealth and stability if the public accepts a series of difficult trade-offs, rejects NIMBYism and sees through the Conservatives' populist lies, Keir Starmer has said. In his first Labour conference speech as Prime Minister, he urged the public to keep faith amid tough and sometimes unpopular choices made by the government, telling them he understood their impatience for real change. Those difficult decisions include building new prisons so that justice could be served, overground pylons to provide cheaper electricity, and accepting that the serious system to tackle irregular migration would also include accepting some asylum seekers. Starmer attempted to draw a line under a week of bruising rows over donations, telling delegates he will not be distracted by noisy criticism of his government, which he regarded as mere glitter on a shirt cuff, a reference to a protest during last year's speech. The Prime Minister left a gathering in Liverpool early to travel to New York on Tuesday for the UN General Assembly, with senior aides pressing for meetings with the US presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. But aides said that he had now started to address concerns, some of them internal, that he had been too gloomy since taking office while trying to level with the public about the economic inheritance. They believe that he is now beginning to explain why the tough choices in front of him, including tax rises and public spending cuts, which are expected in the next month's budget, will be worth it. People ask us now, as we seek patience in pursuit of national renewal, what will we get to show for it? I understand that. After all, what they are used to is a lie, an act, a charade, a performance, he told party delegates. You can call it populism, many people do, but I prefer to call it politics of easy answers, because at its core that's what it is, a deliberate refusal to countenance tough decisions because the political pain is just too much to bear. The time is long overdue for politicians to level with you about the trade-offs this country faces. Because if the last few years have shown us anything, it's that if you bury your head because things are difficult, your country goes backwards. In a speech that used the word Britain 21 times, Starmer condemned the summer's rioting, drawing loud applause while he said the UK unequivocally rejected those involved in violent thuggery and vile racism. To those who say the only way to love your country is to hate your neighbor, because they look different, I say not only do we reject you, we know that you will never win, he said. Because the British values we stand for, not just the rule of law, but a law for this country and our neighbors, the respect for difference under the same flag, that is stronger than bricks, and you know that. In a policy light speech, Starmer announced that veterans, young care leavers, and victims of domestic abuse will be given a guaranteed roof over their head. All free groups will be exempt from local residency tests, which most councils currently have in place to determine who can qualify for social housing. In a message particularly significant in Liverpool, he confirmed that the government would bring forward a Hillsborough law by the time of the next anniversary of the 1989 football stadium disaster in April. And he confirmed that GB Energy, the new publicly owned energy company, will be based in Aberdeen, drawing months of speculation to an end. Starmer's 54-minute address, watched by the cabinet and his wife Victoria, who was wearing a 1105 reportedly borrowed red dress by designer Edeline Lee, was interrupted by a Gaza protester. The Prime Minister angered some of the left of his party when he responded with a prepared line. This guy has obviously got a pass from the 2019 conference, a reference to Labour's catastrophic election defeat under Jeremy Corbyn. However, he also made an unfortunate slip-up, calling for the return of sausages from Gaza, rather than the Israeli hostages taken during Hamas's attack on the 7th of October last year. He quickly corrected his mistake. Starmer said that he understood public cynicism in politics and that he knew how hard it was for the public to hear politicians asking for more. But deep down, I think you know that our country does need a long-term plan and we can't turn it back, he added. I understand many of the decisions we must take will be unpopular. If they were popular, they'd be easy. If you can't take that off on faith, perhaps because you're concerned about the winter fuel allowance, then I get that. If this path were popular or easy, we would have walked it already. He said that he will not be distracted by noisy criticism of his government. All those shouts and bellows, the bad faith advice from people who still hanker for the politics of noisy performance, the weak and cowardly politics of fanaticism. It's water off a duck's back, mere glitter off on a short cuff. It's never distracted me before, and it won't distract me now. Starmer repeatedly promised to create a Britain that belongs to you, an extension of his election mantra of a government of service, and believed to be a reference to the Labour Party's 1959 manifesto. So, since this discusses a speech done at a Labour Congress, of course it will be full of posturing and full of optimism and also trying to avoid controversial takes while also discussing about the current issues. And while Starmer may be appreciated for the fact that he is at least saying that he wants to change something, while he himself may want to change things, but at the same time, already the things that the government changed since we took power in July of this year. Uh, just as the same problem with the Tories as well. They don't have the people and they don't have the vision. And the people when the people don't have the vision, you can dream as many solutions as you want. What he wants to do is definitely something that in great part won't happen, and it won't happen for the same reason that things haven't happened under the Tories. It goes back to the lack of vision. But the situation is already dire enough economically. That's why already even if it has cut on the things that it may not have seen so controversial, but in the end they were like that. Say for example the one with the winter fuel allowance. And here, when it comes to winter fuel, it deserves a better explanation. Uh, Ironically, the winter fuel allowance is something that was implemented by a Labour government in 1997. And so, to some extent, it's funny to see that one of the allowances that they voted decades ago will be the one, they'll be the one that they will not exactly cut it off completely, but they changed the way that, the way and the sum of money that you will get paid if you were a pensioner who would qualify. So, in the end, well, okay, well, winter fuel allowance, will be paid to the more needy, but at the same time, who is here is a discussion which hasn't been settled and will definitely not be settled. It's been going on for 4 centuries already, at least in the case of the UK. So ever since the age of Elizabeth I, who is exactly a deserving and who is exactly an undeserving claimant of wealth on welfare? You see, with this question and considering how much the socioeconomic climate has changed since then, back when the only welfare that was offered would have been either some, well, one-off gifts or payments done by the crown to certain institutions or to certain of the southern counties, which also depended on the favors that the lords of those counties or constituencies had with the sovereign. Mm, Later on, as well as the society changed dramatically due to industrialization, well, the welfare changed into providing a sort of more seasonal support for industries which will not operate year round. One good example, since we're talking about Northern England, was that discretionary payments by the government were done for the factory workers who were working in textile mills because textile mills used to have somewhere between 2 to 3 months of during the course of the year when they will simply not work because cotton was out of season in the U.S. So this was before the War of Independence. And when cotton was out of season and the textile mills processed for all the cotton that they imported from the south of the US, well, you no longer had any cotton to process. So the logical conclusion of those factory owners was that, well, we're going to fire the people, or then we're just going to not pay them. Well, we keep them employed, but we will pay them once there will be cotton in order to process, in order to transform into clothing and textiles. And that didn't sit well with the population in northern England back then. No, since then the argument was pretty simple, where we are factory workers, but we cannot work because of this circumstance outside of everybody's control, which is the cotton growing and harvesting season. But what the hell are we going to do? It wasn't exactly that as easy back then to switch from a job to another because well, the industries became more efficient because a lot of industries were concentrated in the same place. So if, for example, you lived in Liverpool and you worked in a textile mill, well, you worked in a textile mill complex, and it's not like you could walk for 500 meters that way and you find a job in another factory because the other factory owner also needs his own predictability, and he can't exactly employ about tens or hundreds of thousands of people who happen to be out of the job at the same time, who also work in the same industry, the bunch of them, for 3 months because they need this. They definitely work in a business where the work happens either year round, or they definitely need constant workers for a bigger period of time than those 3 months. And that's where the first payments of welfare were done. So that's when the sort of technical unemployment payments appeared. But getting back to this article. mm, I stand by my point that that a lot of these will not change, and whatever change will be implemented, it will be implemented in a sort of horrific way. Um, as I was saying at the beginning of the article, this country's decline is obvious, and it's obvious now more than ever. Okay, the decline of the UK it can be argued that the decline began all the way from the beginning of the 20th century when when the empire realized that the colonies can cost quite a lot of money, and about the only profitable colony was the British Raj, and because everywhere else it proved to be a net drain on the British economy. So in the end, the World War I was the very start of the British Empire breaking up. Is because they had to admit the reality, especially with the financial and logistical demands of war, especially especially a war on that scale. Mm, you can't exactly afford to have imperial projects such as the ones that the British did, which is something that also only in the case of the British it could have happened, because in the cases of the other colonial empires who definitely ran their colonies differently, and in a lot of cases not in a better than in a much worse way for the population colonized. Take for example the French. Mm, in such a scenario, they had to admit that, oh holy shit, we cannot afford this empire. So, but we gotta do something, because we cannot exactly get bankrupt, because if we get bankrupt, we can no longer fight the war. And if we can no longer fight the war, we might as well sign our surrender, because we can't pay the soldiers, we can't pay the factories, we can't pay for the munitions, we can't pay for the transport, we can't pay for anything. You're essentially defaulted. And credit facilities were nowhere near the level back then as they are right now. And even with the ones that are right now, take for example in the best case in right now Ukraine. Even Ukraine is has special arrangements. Plus Ukraine also experiences a completely different context that the UK faced. But at least Ukraine has land borders, and it can do deals with neighboring countries such as the Romanians, the Hungarians, and the Polish in particular. These three countries mainly, to somehow have do separate deals with the governments of those countries in order to bring logistics and produce back on essentially IOUs. The Ukrainian government will be paying in one way or another the debts incurred by the neighbors for the neighbors providing these things that Ukraine requires, either for the war directly, or in order to keep the country functioning as much as possible, as infrastructure allows, if it hasn't been bombed into oblivion by the Russians. But then again, Ukraine is a different scenario. Ukraine is not an island like the UK is, and when it comes to the UK, the island being an island is both a blessing and a curse. Mm, it's a blessing because you can't exactly get invaded on a land route, because there is no land route, and as we've seen, amphibious operations are a very challenging thing. That's why the People's Republic of China may not, highly unlikely, try to invade Taiwan, even though Taiwan is a country which is only a few tens of kilometers wide, and another tens of kilometers long, against a country which has 1 billion people, and even they cannot risk that. But it's also a curse, on the other hand, because if somebody which is a sufficiently strong and sizable naval power, if they end up encircling your country, mm, and if you don't practice autarky, which is something that the UK cannot do at all, well then you're going to be starving in a few weeks to a few months. Why do you think when World War II began, the first thing that appeared was food rationing? Simply because the Germans were so close to starving out Britain and forcing it into surrender. If on one side the Royal Navy did not have the power required in order to fight the German submarines, and if on the other side of the Atlantic, the USA wasn't the economical superpower it was and still is right now to produce so much and in such a volume that no matter how much the Germans or the Japanese could think, they'll produce so much. They'll produce so much more, and even in the worst case scenario, at least some of the stuff can still get where it's meant to. And you may be wondering why is the reason that I tell these stories. It's because even in those moments of great necessity, the politicians and the statesmen of those times had a vision and had an idea. When when I read this article and the article that I read for you, I do not exactly see any indication that there may be even the tiniest sliver of a vision, aside from the fact that, oh yeah, we're gonna build back Britain. Oh yeah, several years ago there was another left-leaning candidate who ended up being a president of a country who marched on this plan with rebuilding. And that person is Joseph Robinette Biden. And where is exactly that program of his of building back better? From the very beginning, the first thing that he did when he entered the White House in January 2020 was to strike down the Keystone XL pipeline, which was back then and still is an important project in order to up the transit of oil that comes from Canada all the way to the refineries and export points from the southern US, where there's a lot of oil industry because hell yeah, you have the Gulf of Mexico where you can extract a lot of oil, plus also all the inland oil reserves, which okay, they're still not as great as they used to be. For example, the oil fields in Texas, but they're still there, and there's also a lot of industry that got built up over the decades there. So at least Keir Starmer didn't come up with a program with a cringe name like Building Back Better, and take in consideration that okay. We have the litmus test when it comes to the Labour Party that Comrade Corbyn got kicked out from the party back at the Brighton Congress in 2019 when that Congress was a complete shit pile and Labour when they lost to fully deservingly. But those people which took Comrade Corbyn away, it's not that Conrad Corbyn, even if he's out of the party, he still has quite a loyal fan base, especially the more rabid leftists in the party still look at him like he's the messiah. But at the same time, that number of people has grown larger over the years since 2019. But at the same time, even the more moderate Labour members who are also members of the parliament and members of the party at the same time, they have also gotten sick of several things, and when it comes to pandering to the local constituency and to the people, we already know that Labour is the best when it does the pandering, and that's why it's going to be concerning what sort of rebuilding Keir Starmer is talking about, uh, because there are bigger issues in this country, and they're definitely not being addressed. They're definitely not being addressed. When you're the country that and this is going to be the bridge towards the next news article. When you have there's such a defective judicial system where you consider it completely normal to try and sentence a person in 3 days for the fact that he was um, he was at a protest which was called into a riot, even though they weren't exactly rioting. They didn't torch houses, they didn't break windows, they didn't set cars on fire, then they didn't loot businesses. They got tried and sentenced in 3 days, and they got a year or two to sit in prison and another year or two of judicial review while outside. So not only you destroy those people's lives because for every business that asks for what we call in the UK a DBS check, but for the rest of the people, it's essentially a declaration from the police that you don't have any crimes on the record, and if you do, what crimes have you got? Right there. So not only you destroy the lives of those people because it may take years later to struck those off the permanent record so that they can get employed into a normal business, they'll be condemned to work into shit tire the slave warehousing jobs because they were there expressing their concerns over an issue that has been here for quite a few years, and there have been many other members of the public and politicians as well that warned towards this. And here we are, all those warnings fell into deaf ears. And let's be honest here, Labour will not do something against the migratory waves because he hasn't done it in the past and he definitely won't start doing it now, particularly since a lot of the special interest groups tied to Labour also stand the most to gain out of this enterprise with the economic migrants and the so-called asylum seekers. And even those asylum seekers, let's be honest, even this country in itself does not respect the laws which it has agreed to with other countries. To take, for example, up until Brexit, when technically the EU rule that every potential asylum seeker had to apply for asylum in the country in the country which they first entered. And since all of them, since the vast majority of them came from either the south, came either from the south of Europe or east of Europe, or like more like southeast of Europe. Mm, why are those? You do have quite a lot of them in Italy and in Albania and in Greece and in Bulgaria and in Hungary as well. But there are also so many more that which they sidestepped the regulation because they didn't want to stay in those countries because they're not the ones running from actually unsafe conditions of living, more so. And by unsafe conditions of living, I mean your house is getting bombed at a certain time, or the country is experiencing a civil war. In And in such cases, they could have lived relatively decently in Italy or in Spain or in Bulgaria or in Hungary or in Romania if those crazy enough happen to come from that corridor. But no, they don't want to stay there. The vast majority of them are stuck there, but they're stuck there against their will. They don't want to be there because they didn't come here to escape from a war or from a catastrophe. They came here in order to get the welfare money, which is why all of them are going towards the West. Um, it's absolutely insulting to anyone's intelligence. So when you try to argue with them that, oh yeah, these are people that are running from a war and you see they've been through so many countries that they've been through so many difficulties. Well, excuse me, but why can't they stay away from the war in Italy or in some other country except this one? Especially since the UK and Ireland being some of the westernmost countries and the most difficult countries that you can come to, logistically speaking, because both are islands and both are tens of kilometers to hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest landmass. Mm, you you can see that it takes a certain level of effort and it takes a certain level of network in order for those people to come here. And at the same time this country's legislation that still has laws from the days of King John. So from the Magna Carta, from the 11th, 12th century from now, can you really not find a law absolutely anywhere in order to put it back on these people and to actually apply the law that you are so much saying that yes, we have the rule of law. Where is it the rule of law when bureaucracy gets swamped when it comes to deporting these people as they should have been because they aren't here because they are here illegally again. Yeah, we recognize this term, actual illegality, and they're illegal according to your own rules, and they're also illegal according to the rules that you've agreed with other countries to respect. So instead of doing that, there are you have the special interest groups, you have the NGOs, and then you also have, yes, the judiciary, which is exactly cooperating. Speaking of what Horowitz said regarding the US, well, even though the system functions differently here in the UK, the turn towards leftism in the judiciary and in other government establishments has been obvious for so many years. And with the common law system, it gets even worse uh, when you have judges, especially with particularly legislating from the bench through their decisions, and if and with jurisprudence having already built up and not in the favor of and not in the favor of the grand population of this country, mm, you have the rest of the people who shouldn't be here, who get away exactly through schemes, exactly through stratagems, because these are stratagems in the end. They're unofficial channels, or okay, if they're official channels, but there are unconventional things that you have to resort to if you want, as an economic migrant, to stay here, and at the same time serving the interest of the larger groups. So excuse me, but these are the things that just changes in procedure. This could have been done without having to create a lot of shit shows within the public populace. Okay, yes, the judges would have moaned, the solicitors would have moaned, the bar associations would have moaned about it. Well, the NGOs would have moaned, but then at the end of the day, you're the government. What are they going to do to you? Are they simply not going to no longer rule on any cases? Well, they can't, because if they don't rule on any cases, that means that they're no longer doing their job. So overall, this is the situation that the UK is in, and I personally don't see it getting any better. In fact, I expect it getting worse. Hopefully, I'll not be here to see too much of that worst part coming. And speaking of the bridge that I was talking about regarding prisons, now this article I took from The Guardian again because they're apparently the better outlet when it comes to developing some news, more like writing more about them, because this article I initially read about in the Evening Standard, but it was really slim. So, prison isn't working for women, Labour says, as it unveils plans for alternatives. Shabana Mahmood tells conference she wants more help in community for offenders and fewer cases going to court. Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, has declared that prison isn't working for women, as she announced a package of measures to reduce the number of females in the prison estate. Plans to treat more women in the community, resolve cases involving women before they get to court, and drive down the number of young women self-harming will be drawn up by a new body of experts, the Justice Secretary said in a conference speech on Tuesday. Alluding to the phrase popularized by former Tory Home Secretary Michael Howard, who said in 1993 that prison works, Mahmood said the system had failed female offenders and pledged to cut the number of women's jails. She added, for women, prison isn't working. Rather than encouraging rehabilitation, prison forces women into a life of crime. After leaving a short custodial sentence, a woman is significantly more likely to commit a further crime than one given a non-custodial sentence. The shameful fact is that we have known this for 2 decades. In 2007, Baroness Jean Corsten, another pioneering Labour woman, undertook a landmark review. It was clear then, and it is clear now, that if we change how we treat women in prison, we cut crime, keep families together, and end the harm that passes from one generation to the next. For that reason, I am today announcing that this government will launch a new body, the Women's Justice Board. The goal will be clear: to reduce the number of women going to prison with the ultimate ambition of having fewer women's prisons. She pointed to evidence that about two-thirds of women are in prison for non-violent offences and that most, 55%, are victims of domestic abuse. She described women's prisons as desperate places that are hurting mothers and breaking homes and forcing women into a life of crime rather than rehabilitating them. The board will publish a new three-pronged strategy in the spring, she said. Firstly, how we intervene earlier, looking at how to resolve cases before they go to court. Secondly, how we make community support, such as residential women's centers, a viable alternative to prison. So here's the grift that I was talking about. And thirdly, how we address the acute challenge of young women in custody who are less than a tenth of the population but account for over a third of all self-harm, she said. Earlier on Tuesday, the prisons minister, James Timpson, told delegates at a fringe meeting that he sees lots of very ill women when he visits prisons and will drive down the numbers incarcerated. We need to decide as a society what is the best way to help these women. And when I was younger, my parents were foster parents and my mom specialized in looking after the babies of women who were inside the prison. So we spent hours and hours waiting outside the prison while my mom went in. And even then, it felt wrong, and it feels wrong now, he said. Community orders should be trusted more by the courts as an alternative to jail, Lord Timpson suggested, signaling a potential change in approach to dealing with lower-level crimes. The government has ordered the sentencing review, which is expected to begin this autumn and come forward with proposals in the spring. Mahmoud was forced to announce an early scheme for prisoners just days after taking office following warnings that the prison system was at a breaking point. So you see exactly what I was discussing in the earlier article regarding to how a few people that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong protest, they got tried and sentenced in 3 days. But on the other side, when it comes to women, they did not exactly address the underlying issues, other than saying that there should be less women in the prisons, and then there should be some other things that should be done in the community so that they don't end up there. If this isn't hypocrisy, I don't know what other better term to call it, because it simply is something like that. And so let's take this article over as it is. Forcing women into a life of crime rather than rehabilitating them. Well, of course, you force them into a life of crime when you can, when after you're out of the prison, regardless if you're a male or a woman, you have this permanent record, and every deed and every reasonable business in this country asks for it when you get employed. And when you do, and they see and they see God knows what else, that you commit domestic violence, or you committed aggravated assault, or if you've consumed drugs, because there's always a combination of these. It's never just one single thing. And of course, they're not going to employ you. And so from that moment on, up until many years, until you can depose and appeal in order to have these struck from your permanent record, you're condemned to work either really shitty jobs with other criminals, or if you live in an area where you don't have even those sort of jobs, well, then you're just going to stay at home and you're not going to do anything, and you're going to revert back to the old habits that got you into trouble in the first place. Rehabilitating should first start for both genders, mind you, into not having such punishing measures outside of the prison system. And speaking of this, Shabana Mahmoud also mentioned that, of course, that well, the two-thirds of women are in prison for non-violent offenses. Well, and that's obvious well, definitely people who watch this are not of the opinion that men and women are the same. And of course, the manifestations of behaviors, especially when it comes to crimes committed, obviously differ. Uh, because men and women are definitely different, and also men and women have not only different roles to play within a family and a society, but they're also fundamentally different when it comes to functionality. Uh, that's what. Well, how many cases of female serial killers do you know? Well, there aren't that many. There sure are, but proportionally there are much less than when it comes to men. Of course, because the tendencies of women are not exactly like that, and of course, so the women would tend towards more non-violent offenses than men do. But here saying that most, and by that meaning 55%, they're victims of domestic abuse. Well, excuse me, but uh, what sort of country can you call yourself that you have the rule of law, where you try to find pathetic excuses to for the people that you in the end you in the end are the same country that sentenced them to prison. So if you're saying in public that the people you've sentenced they're actually victims, that they're actually victims themselves, and somehow you try to do some mental gymnastics where because of the fact that they were victims they resorted to these crimes, but since they committed these crimes, the penal law is pretty clear when it comes to this, and for the things that she did, she has to serve a prison sentence of God knows how many years, and well, God knows what sort of conditions. And you see the problem here. You see the problem here because it's hypocritical, and you're trying to shift away the blame from the fact that at the end of the day, women are also adults in the society, and when you are an adult in a society, it comes with its own rights, it comes with its own responsibilities, but it also comes with its own consequences. And when it comes to consequences, see, if you are to shoot a person in the face and you kill them, uh, okay, the rationale when you are getting tried at the court matters, but at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that you shot a person in the face and you killed it. You'll still be tried for murder, no matter if you have a rationale or no rationale. And the only way that you can weasel out in that circumstance would be to subject yourself to psychiatric review to determine whether you are perfectly sane or if you are insane. Maybe then your sentencing may differ, but at the end of the day, you're still going to have on your criminal record the fact that you've been sentenced for murder, no matter what the rationale behind it may be. And this is what I find really dishonest in this article, that it's trying to make this connection that oh no, the vast majority or the majority of women that are there were initially victims of domestic abuse, so the circumstances from their life made them resort to violent or non-violent offenses. Well, that's not exactly how things work. It's also not just dishonest to make these sorts of connections, but you're also undermining the judicial process and the justice system of your country if you are saying in public that either these things should matter, or if these things matter in such a way that you're preventing the course of justice. If you really want to change these, and I know that you cannot change these because okay, you do have every penal law in a lot of countries in the world has some crimes that can definitely be committed by women, and there are some differences in interpretation when it comes to penal law depending on the situation we're discussing about. Say, for example, if a newborn baby dies, say, and here I'm going to use a case from the US. If a newborn baby dies, and the newborn is between the ages of 0 to say 2 years old, if the mother killed it, it's going to be considered an infanticide, which carries much smaller prison sentences plus it also takes you through psychiatric reviews and then many psychiatric consultations and psychologists as well. But if a man does it, it's going to be considered a first-degree murder, and for that you get anywhere up to 25 years in jail and potentially even on the death penalty if you're in one of those states that still practices it. It rarely ever happens somebody who kills a man who killed a newborn to end up on the death row, but sentences are definitely disproportionately larger for a man. And okay, we can understand that we can consider this to be reasonable because when it comes to women and infanticide and resorting to infanticide, it could also be due to the context which that woman is living. Say, for example, if she's concerned with not being able to afford anything and she's starving, but she has to keep the kid alive. It may be indeed a messed up conclusion to get to, but if you are to look at it cynically, it's not exactly incorrect. It's still not an excuse the fact that the person is resorting to that, taking again another human's life, and especially another human's life which cannot defend itself in this way. Is definitely an issue. Plus, there could also be other cases. Well, as far as I remember, there have been studies in psychology done, especially in prisons, where regarding getting calls for infanticide, the vast majority of women that were in prison for infanticide were women who were suffering from postpartum depression, which was not addressed. That carries its own separate conversation as to okay, well, they suffer from postpartum depression, but for that normally you should have temporary psychiatrical treatment, which tends to function most of the time. It's one of the very rare cases when psychiatry does a good thing from time to time, aside from the mountain of bullshit and dead bodies behind it. But that could also be a case. Okay, in that case, I can understand this aspect of rehabilitation or having to avoid these scenarios from happening at the very beginning. But the issue is much larger than that, and it's not just that. Here I'm just providing. I'm somehow unwillingly helping labor by saying that approaching these niche circumstances in the real world could actually from a community aspect could actually do you much better than having to take the women and rail them through the justice system. But it's not that. It's not that big, and it's never like that. This is just going to be trying to save the system which is already beyond saving, which is a prison system. It's overcrowded for a reason. There are some very good reasons why it's overcrowded. There are also very stupid reasons why they're overcrowded. And even though I am of the principle that when it comes to justice system, it's better for 100 guilty people to go unsentenced rather than one innocent person to be sentenced as being guilty. There are certain limits on how far you can go to how much do you actually permit within a society, and definitely what she's trying to do is going to be blatant favoritism towards a single gender, and here the article outlined for us is exactly what she wants to do, and exactly how labor wants to build a better, more reliable base of voters. Just like in the article written by Horowitz. They're going to work at the community level, so intervening earlier. So that means that there are going to be some local councils that will have either NGOs, or they're going to have groups organized that will be discussing about these. And of course, they're going to be concerned only about women, so there will be only women there who will be attending though who will be attending those councils. And of course, since Labour is the one that pioneered this not revolutionary idea, they're going to be at the forefront of it, and they're going to be the so-called representatives. See, we come from the Labour government. We came with this measure, and here we came here to start implementing this measure. And more so, it goes even further. We're sticking to community support. Mahmoud gave the example of residential women's centers. That's essentially another grift allocated for the local clientele in the local councils to build more stuff. Of course, building more stuff means that the economy grows, and then they're also going to have a permanent grift where the local councils will receive money from the government in order to support these schemes. And while okay, I understand that these schemes are definitely better than the alternative, which is sending the women to prison, where they'll definitely cost not only much more, but God knows where they'll be set, because there aren't many prisons for women in the UK. I think, if I remember correctly, there are about five or six in the entire country, and of course the proportion is so much smaller. At the latest statistic, there are almost 98,000 men locked up in prisons, but while there are about 5,600 women in the UK as of 2024. And one of the arguments that was also made, this article hasn't mentioned it, is that women's prisons are also more harmful because since there aren't that many female criminals as a proportion, because of course there aren't. Those prisons are also those prisons are also much smaller than men's prisons, but they're also put in more inconvenient places, so they're put much further than some men's prisons would be. So okay, that's a fair point. That's a fair point to make. But again, um, you're resorting to grifting. Even you're grifting with good intentions, but grifting nonetheless at the end of the day. And if this is obvious to me, it's definitely obvious to other people that this is just it's a scheme God forbid it actually does things and change things, because if it changes things, it will definitely change them into a much more biased towards women way. And is definitely going to surpass at one point the limit of where exactly do we draw the line between imprisoning people who may actually provide a reasonable case as to why they did what they did, and where exactly do we actually avoid sentencing people just for the hell of it, and we're exactly ending up on the other side where we're perpetuating some behaviors within society, and in this case specifically within women, where they know that if there are no consequences for their actions, where they're just going to continue, and things will get even worse. That's also why this principle of being equal in the eyes of the law is so important, because if you start treating if you start treating different groups of people preferentially, if you start treating a different gender preferentially, like it's the case in this country, especially when you go as far as trying to pervert the course of justice in order to get your political brownie points, because those are the ones that you committed to. Well, what can I say? This may not be the main reason why this country is in decline, but it's definitely contributing to this reason. Moving on now towards the conflict which is going on in Ukraine, but also Zelensky or the Zelensky administration stating the obvious that a bunch of people knew, but apparently the Western population is finding out right now. You're active. China contributes 60% of Russian weapons foreign components, says Ukraine. Nearly two-thirds of foreign main components in Russian weapons are produced in or re-exported from China, a senior Ukrainian official said on Tuesday. Vladislav Vasyuk, an advisor on sanctions policy to President Volodymyr Zelensky, told reporters in Brussels that roughly 60% of foreign-made microchips, circuit boards and other critical components used in Russia's military apparatus, including drones and missiles, are manufactured or resold by Chinese firms. If you take all the usual types of weapons and count how many foreign-made components are inside, there will be roughly about 60% made in the PRC or imported from the PRC, he said. Vlasyuk also warned that EU and US sanctions on Moscow have failed to prevent a lot of these components, many of which he said were originally intended for civilian use, from being sourced from Western companies. There are a lot of microelectronics being made based on Western technologies, he said, but added the People's Republic of China is the biggest problem. China, whose total trade with Russia hit a record high of $240 billion last year, has repeatedly been accused by US and European capitals of aiding Russia's war effort through its sale of dual-use and other equipment to Moscow. In an escalation of such allegations, in July, NATO leaders accused China of being a decisive enabler of the conflict and urged Beijing to cease all material and political support to Russia's war effort. On a visit to Brussels this month, US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell similarly alleged that Beijing is providing very substantial military support to Moscow, including direct support for Russia's defense industrial base. China has denounced these allegations as biased, slanderous, and provocative. EU sanctions envoy David O'Sullivan told reporters on Tuesday that Brussels is currently working on how to better monitor global supply chains to make sure that European products cannot find their way to Russia. A report sent to reporters by the Ukrainian office of the president on Tuesday found that at least 6 European companies have provided components used in Russian weaponry. Switzerland's ST Microelectronics and Traco Electronic AG, the Netherlands' NXP Semiconductor, Ireland's Taoglas, Germany's Infineon Technologies AG, and Italy's Finder. I do not question the good faith of the companies that do not wish to see their products used this way, O'Sullivan said, but it is true that once you sell these products to distributors or to third parties, you do not always fully control what happens next. Asked whether he thought Chinese firms are similarly acting in good faith, Sullivan said, I think the answer you would get from the Chinese is that they don't consider these components to be dual use with both civilian and military applications. These are normal civilian applications. From our perspective, it's very clear that though they may appear innocent items, they have a clear military application. And this is what we have tried to persuade our Chinese colleagues to understand, he added. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the EU has imposed 14 rounds of sanctions against the Kremlin to hinder the country's ability to source materials to support its war effort. Its latest package, announced in June, targeted 19 Chinese firms accused of directly supporting Russia's military-industrial complex through the sale of dual-use weapons. Its 13th package, adopted in February, blacklisted 4 Chinese firms accused of trading in the area of electronics components, including of EU origin. Tensions between Brussels and Beijing have also flared in recent months amid Brussels' ongoing anti-subsidy investigation into China-made electric vehicles and Beijing's retaliatory probes into EU exports of brandy, dairy, and pork. Regarding electric vehicles, this will be discussed later. Echoing O'Sullivan's remarks, Vlasyuk noted that Kyiv must find more arguments to convince China to cease supplying such components. China's leader, Xi Jinping, declared a no-limits friendship with his counterpart Vladimir Putin just weeks before Moscow's charge on eastern Ukrainian borders. At some point in time, I think that the Chinese government will understand that supplying Russians with these microparts is something it would ideally avoid doing, Vasyuk said. We just have to find some, maybe more, arguments for the Chinese government to persuade it. Vasyuk's comments will also come amid an increasingly fractious relationship between Kyiv and Beijing. On a visit to Singapore in June this year, Zelensky publicly rebuked China for attempting to disrupt the peace summit in Switzerland at Moscow's behest. Regrettably, it is unfortunate that such a big, independent, powerful country as China is an instrument in the hands of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Zelensky said. Earlier this month, the Ukrainian leader also chastised a joint Brazil-China peace plan for ending the war as destructive, arguing the proposal effectively called on Kiev to give up on its territory. Now, just start from the very beginning. What exactly is the situation with the Chinese selling these products to the Russians? Well, for starters, it's that China, being the country that it is, also looks all after its own interests when it's concerned with the situation in Russia, particularly China couldn't care less realistically about the war that Putin got himself into. And yes, now I say the war because even Putin himself mentioned the war at the Russian news television. So now it's no longer the case that it's a special military operation. When the dear leader himself said it is a war, we're going to treat it as a war. And getting back to the reason why China is doing this, it's that it truly is a risky maneuver for the Chinese to support the Russians. And make no mistake, the Chinese are supporting the Russians. Only that there are different methods, and there are a lot of complicated ways in which China supports Russia's side in the war. But they also do it in order to serve their own interests. And one of the big interests it's serving is that, the Chinese as a people, there are some people who do not forget. They tend not to forget things, and they do not forget especially the fact that they've been trampled over by Russians, whether they were called back then the Tsarist Empire. They don't forget the fact that they've been trampled over and they got duped into signing a lot of deals and having even outright territories annexed from them. See, for example, the case of Port Arthur, which essentially was just a concession given by who was a Qing emperor back then to the Tsar of Russia, and the Tsar of Russia pulled the traditional Russian maneuver of yes, so we're going to. Initially, it was just for the port, just to build a rail line to the port. But then, once they built a rail line, and of course, the Tsar sent troops in order to defend the rail line construction. With those troops, the Tsar just decided to annex the entire region alongside with the port and with the rail line, and keep those troops there. Such tricks are not forgotten easily by China. And China is somehow, whether you want to believe me or not, it's cooking its own sort of vengeance when it comes to Russia as a nation. And, and I'm pretty sure that Putin himself knows this. And even recently, I read an article weeks ago that apparently whoever was Xi Jinping's mentor in the People's Liberation Army, well, that guy was apparently very anti-Soviet, but particularly very anti-Russian. So little by little, those who have the eyes to see can get a grasp of how the situation is realistically. And the way I'm considering that China wants to play its vengeance against Russia for the things Russia did towards China in the past would be exactly to pretend at the surface level that they're supporting. They're also making money, and the money is desperately needed in China since China isn't doing economically really great with all the with all the commerce and all the business that used to be before the pandemic, and most of it which never came back after the pandemic was over. But at the same time, at a geopolitical level, China is looking to also further bolster its own economy by taking over in first stages financially, and possibly in the later stages potentially boots on the ground. But this will be discussed only after. the Russian-Ukraine conflict will be concluded, to take over a lot of raw resources and hydrocarbons, which happen to be in eastern Russia, which also at the same time happens to be closest to China altogether. And China needs those things much more than the Russians do, because the Russians have had them for so long, and they haven't exactly done much with it. And whatever they've done with it, they've ended up doing a complete shit pile at the end. See, for example, what Lindsey Graham, I think, said many years ago, that Russia is a gas station with an attitude. And let's be honest here, if Russia didn't, if Russians and of course the Germans, if the Germans didn't enable the Russians by sending them thousands of kilometers of industrial pipes in order to connect the the oil and gas fields from Russia with Europe, and especially German businesses, to provide a cheap energy resource. Uh, this conflict could have played in a completely different way, or we could actually even argue as much as say that this conflict may have actually not happened, because if the Russians wouldn't have had this money printer essentially, they wouldn't have had the the calculations required in order to even risk going to a war like this. And we can see right now, and make sure that even if yes, the press is guilty for burning out the population on the sanctions packages, and never explaining that sanctions take a while to show their effects against an economy, and obviously against a society, when you start cutting it off from important things, such as in certain specialized industrial imports, and the most painful one being getting cut from global transfer systems, such as SWIFT. Um, you can start seeing which way this direction goes. And even if yes, Russians, just like typical Eastern Europeans, also still manage to hold considerable cash reserves in foreign currency, and when it comes to foreign currency, I'm talking here especially about US dollars. But those US dollars are okay. Even those have their own limits, and it's not like you work in Russia but you get paid in US dollars outright. You get paid in rubles. So even those reserves, depending on how you use them, will inevitably reach to an end. Not to mention all, all the rules of capital controls that appeared from the beginning of the war for the Russian government to stop the bleeding of hard currency back overseas or back to its population. And this is pretty much the reason why China is playing this game. And even China, let's give credit where credit is due. At least to some of the sanctions measures, they did apply them, but they applied them not because in order to screw the Russians directly, or because there may have been a business deal gone wrong, but it's because the Chinese are definitely more afraid of the Americans than they are of the Russians. That's the reason why UnionPay and Alipay had significant outages in Russia, which made it essentially unusable. But also, apparently, in the past few weeks, and in this week in particular, it appeared in the news that a lot of Chinese banks refuse, on average, anywhere between 60 to 80% of money transfers done in yuans from Russia, specifically because they are afraid of not leaving a trace in the digital ecosystem, and that trace may be discovered by the Americans, and the Americans may start getting ideas of how to squeeze the Chinese harder out of their money. Even if to some extent it's beneficial for the Chinese for another country to use its own currency, as Russia is forced right now because the doors are just simply shut off uh, to any other hard and forty currency, and at the same time there aren't any viable alternatives. See, for example, the debacle with the Indian oil exports, and how the Indians pay them with rupees, and the Russians are stuck with some tens of billions of rupees that they have absolutely nothing to do with because nobody wants to buy them. Mm, it shows that the Chinese are doing some things, but they're not doing some things because they really want to be on this sanctions package bandwagon. It's because they're more afraid of any potential direct consequences that may face them rather than with anybody else, whether it is uh, something simple as accepting yuan payments from Russia. If and here I'm talking about yuan payments, and why this is important because accepting US dollar payments as a Chinese bank or as a Chinese financial entity from Russia, that by default puts you in the crosshairs of the US Department of Treasury and the IRS and the American federal government altogether. That's also why, for example, when drugs were a significant issue in South America, the main reason why the Americans got into it is that they initially saw that quite a lot of the currency was going into South America without any real justification. It's not like a South American country got rid of its own currency and turned to the dollar. Or it's not like South American countries experienced some really explosive developmental growth, which required, for example, for exports, hard currency like US dollars in order to fund those imports and those exports, whichever way they may go. No, it's because, and the reason why the Americans got involved is that because their money was concerned when it came to the drugs transactions. And not to mention the issues that came because of those drugs uh, when they arrived in the US. But first of all, they were concerned with what the hell is happening with the money. That's why that's why holding US dollars is always a good idea. Um, unless you made significant amounts of money through illegal means. And that's why when you possess US dollars, you also the federal government, the US government also possesses the power in order to screw you over out of all that money. And if you don't have it cash, then you may not be able to do much with it when you're going to see that your bank accounts get frozen and you can no longer essentially use US dollars in any way except whatever cash you have. And even then, in limited scenarios, because when you're a sanctioned person, it's not that you are sanctioned yourself, but anybody that does business with you will appear will appear in the system that they've done business with you, and they're also at the risk of getting screwed by the sanctions. And simply a lot of entities would simply not work with you, particularly if the U.S. sanctions you. It's not just the federal government that sanctions you, but that closes the doors at every sort of U.S. public or private institution. You cannot even go and rent a car if you are sanctioned. If you happen to be in the US simply because you're a sanctioned person, you cannot even rent a car like that way. As the last topic regarding this, so that we could also continue. There's also this part with avoiding sanctions. Um, I personally consider just like how several months ago I've discussed about how the European Union in particular wants to implement monitoring and tracing systems to see that, for example, cotton products which come from China or cotton products which use raw materials from China and do not use the Chinese slave labor that's implemented in on those cotton plantations. And then after that, there is a scenario where this one's a more recent development with chocolate that's sold in the EU must have some sort of tracing mechanisms to uh, in order to for the cocoa beans which are used in chocolate manufacturing to not be coming from some sort of quasi-slave plantations. To they should be coming from places where which are either tied to something called like the Rainforest Alliance or fair or other fair trade institutions to confirm that that yes, the cocoa that's used in whatever chocolate that you like to eat that's made in Europe, whether it's Cadbury or Lindt or whether you come from Belgium or Switzerland, all the cocoa beans that were used in providing in making that chocolate come from farmers that have been paid fairly. But the system in itself, considering how complicated supply chains have become over the years, and with more globalization, it gets even more complicated, and in ways that absolutely no person, no committee, no institution can monitor such a thing and can't even grasp how complicated things can be. It's simply not going to work, and that's why sanctions in China don't work either. Because even if I've said earlier that China definitely needs the money that it can make off the backs of the Russians when the Russians are shut off from the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the industrial world. On the other side, on the other side, you also have much smaller interests, both within the CCP and within the Chinese population, which just simply identified that there are some grifts that they can put themselves into, and they can trade from one place to another, and in this case from China to Russia, things that may be of dual use, which also both have a civilian use but also military use. And at the end of the day, these Chinese interests don't give a shit about what the Russians are going to do with the products that they're selling, as long as they're selling. And this sort of mentality is also another thing that I mentioned in other podcasts. This speaks some larger volumes of how the rules of business and the rules of economy go into operate when it comes to China. And in China, for starters, it's of little concern if a certain business either makes money or if it loses money, because when a business loses money, they can always get the money from local authorities, or in the worst case, from getting payments from Beijing. The main focus of that business is to employ the people there, so that people don't have idle time. And with that lack of idle time, and with those absurd working schedules like 996, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, you don't exactly give the people too much time and too much energy in order to look at what has the CCP been doing lately. Oh no. What have our neighbors done lately? Oh no. No. That's what they're trying to avoid, and plus they're trying to avoid this aspect as well. But they're also trying to provide um, employment to people so they can afford food to eat and a place to rent and a bed to sleep into. And here I'm not going to, here yes I did correct myself saying a bed to sleep in, because if you live in Hong Kong. And you're at the beginning, that may be your only opportunity. Even a shoebox apartment may be too expensive for you, so you may be temporarily condemned to sleeping in the pod. Or and this is it. There are definitely smaller players, and it's expected to have smaller players in a country which is still 1 billion people, and especially since it's a country of 1 billion people which also had a communist system and still has a communist system, even though it's not as ideologically Marxist-Leninist, but it looks more like state capitalism. But even there, I would disagree, but that's a different debate. Mm, the the country still has no, not exactly solid, but consistent relationships with Russia and and it used to have with the former Soviet Union also, and also there were other conflicts between China and the Soviet Union. Take for example the ideological differences between Khrushchev and Mao Zedong, which led to the China-Soviet Union split. But then those conflicts did get resolved. But in the end, in such a large country like this, we still have a lot of people that learned Russia because that learned Russian and who still know Russian simply because they were either made by the party or they did it by themselves. They found some sort of businesses or enterprises or some occupations which had to do something with Russia or with a Russian-speaking nation, because it's not just Russia in itself. Now these days, or not the Soviet Union, but you also have Central Asia. Okay, the Chinese people have a really complicated language, but they really expect the Chinese people to learn Kyrgyz or Tajik or Kazakh language in order to interact in order to interact economically with the countries from Central Asia. No, they're going to no, they're going to discuss in Russian because Russian is even used by those countries as well. Because simply because there is no expectation for potential foreign partners to learn those languages. Okay, maybe a nice bonus, but at the end, most of the business will not be carried out. So it will be carried out in what's the most common language, and that is Russian. Fucking hell, Kyrgyzstan is the country which up until the Soviets took over, they didn't publish books at all. So many years after they got integrated into the Soviet Union, mm, they finally had an author which wrote a book, and that book happened to be anti-Soviet, but that anti-Soviet book written by that Kyrgyz national author was the only book that was published in the Kyrgyz language. So it's not like Moscow can say, well, no, we can no longer support this book because it says nasty things about us, because not even the Muscovites could read what was in that book. So overall, this is how the situation is. Uh, China in itself maybe trying to at least avoid some flack that may come there, especially from the side of the U.S. But avoiding sanctions with the way the supply chains are so complicated and there are so many backdoors and loopholes that you can operate. No, and here I'm not even talking about what you can do in China directly, but hell, this is in the end a globalized world, so you don't exactly have to be a company in China if you really want to sell dual use stuff. You don't have to be specifically in China. You can be in a country neighboring Russia, and the country which at least isn't pro-Russia because let's be honest, there are no countries which currently surround Russia which could be considered pro-Russian. But at least a country which could at least turn a blind eye towards your business as long as you're paying your taxes. Все добре. Mm, you could operate such a shell company for Kazakhstan, for example, which is a country that borders directly Russia, and where you could have a reasonable excuse that okay, well, we sold these things, but then we're a company that we happen to sell these things to Russia, or you can simply go even further in if you want to hide if you want to hide your trail, you can definitely hide your trail. In a lot of ways, and be sure that there are a lot of Chinese people that know this, and so even if, say, China were to go all the way into the sanctions bandwagon, which will never do, it's not like the okay, some of the commerce would definitely get squashed, but some of it will definitely not be because there's always that greed aspect into people, they will end up selling those products which are considered of dual use in other ways. Okay, it will not be through China. Let's look at the map. What other direct neighbors does Russia have? Well, you have Mongolia, you have Kazakhstan. Just to provide two examples. So solutions can always be found, and okay, uh, China to some extent is just prolonging the inevitable. Just prolonging the inevitable, and they're also playing their own game while trying to stay as low as possible in order to not involve other actors. Now, moving on further south, let's see what's happening with, speaking of China, what's happening with the unofficial colonies of China. Al Jazeera. Marxist-leaning Dissanayake wins Sri Lanka's election. What's next? From an IMF deal he wants to renegotiate to parliamentary elections, President-elect faces key challenges. Marxist-leaning Anura Kumara Dissanayake has taken office as Sri Lanka's president shortly after winning the country's election. Dissanayake, who was sworn in on Monday after winning Saturday's polls, has inherited a top job in a nation battered by austerity measures imposed as a part of a bailout deal with the International Monetary Fund. The austerity measures, hikes in income taxes and electricity prices, were introduced under ongoing President Ranil Wickremesinghe. Wickremesinghe took over as a leader after his predecessor Gotabaya Rajapaksa was ousted in 2022 following the country's economic collapse amid mass public protests that Dissanayake and his political party, the Janata Vigmuti Peramuna (GVP), were part of. In his inauguration speech, Dissanayake pledged cleaner politics. People have called for a different political culture, he said. I am ready to commit to that change. Who is the new president of Sri Lanka? Dissanayake, 55, won the presidency in a second round of counting after winning 42.3% support in the first round. His closest rival, Sajit Premadasa, got 32.8% of votes in the first round. A second round of counting, in which preferential votes from the top two candidates are added, was needed because no candidate secured 50% votes in the first round. Disanayake's party is part of the National People's Power Alliance, which he leads. The GVP led anti-state insurrections in the 1970s and 1980s. Dissanayake was first elected into parliament in 2000. The GVP has never been close to power in the past, and Dissanayake won just 3% of the vote in 2019's presidential election. However, Dissanayake played an active role in the 2022 protests against Rajapaksa's rule, known as the Aragalia, Sinhalese for struggle. His popularity has risen since then. His presidential campaign was built on the promise of fighting corruption. Dissanayake has also been critical of Wickremesinghe's $2.9 billion bailout deal with the IMF. Now in power, he faces questions over how he might navigate the island nation's economic challenges at a time when it is deeply fractured. While campaigning, the MPP argued that the current terms of the IMF program are not favorable to the disadvantaged poor and working classes. Rajni Gamage, a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, told Al Jazeera. Cuts in social welfare schemes and increases in taxes made by Wickremesinghe's government as a result of the IMF deal have hurt economically weaker sections of society the most. They, the MPP, feel like the deal has been quite unfair and that it favors the more wealthier sections more, Gamage said. Dissanayake said he will renegotiate the IMF bailout loan to make austerity measures more bearable. But he and his party have made it clear that they do not plan to scrap the deal and will seek only tweaks. Dissanayake has not spelled out what provisions the IMF pact he might look to renegotiate. In general, though, Dissanayake's party envisions a protectionist local economy, prioritizing local industrialization, domestic production, and favoring small and medium enterprises. She explained that while the final targets of the IMF program cannot be changed, what is possible is that you can negotiate where the revenue comes from and where the expenditure is made. The bailout was secured in March 2023, and the arrangement is for 4 years. Wickremesinghe has warned that altering the basic terms of the IMF deal could delay the disbursement of the fourth portion of the loan. Sri Lanka's dollar bonds fell by 3 cents on Monday amid worries among investors over any standoff between the new government and the IMF if Dissanayake seeks to revisit the terms of the bailout. Sri Lanka has a system of what is known as an executive presidency, much like the United States or France. In effect, that means that the president is both head of state and head of government. While as president, Dissanayake will have the power to issue executive orders, he will need the support of parliament to pass laws. And that's where he faces his next political challenge. In the current parliament, the right-wing Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, also known as the Sri Lanka's People Front of the Rajapaksa family, holds a majority with 145 of the 225 seats. The Samgi Jana Balawegaya of the main opposition of leader Premadasa holds 54 seats. The Ilankai Tamila Arasu Kachichi, the largest Tamil party, has 10 seats. Disanayake's MPP has only 3 seats, and the other smaller parties have the remaining 13 seats. The new president has already made clear while campaigning for election that he will dissolve the current parliament and call for new elections. Without new elections, the current parliament could run into the 20th of August 2025. Disanayake's argument for the dissolution of the parliament is simple. The existing makeup of parliament showed that the SLPP of the Rajapaksa party in particular had lost broad support. Sri Lanka's constitution requires snap elections to be held within 3 months of the dissolution of parliament. Opinion polls conducted as recently as August indicate a close race if the parliamentary elections were held then. The SJB and NPP were shoulder to shoulder with 29% and 28% respectively, according to a poll conducted last month by the Institute for Health Policy. The SLPP was at 19%. If parliamentary elections throw up such a result, Sri Lanka could have what is known as a cohabitation government, in which the president and the prime minister are from 2 different political parties. Given the economic precarity of Sri Lanka, a cohabitation government does not bode well as you need more consensus and ideological coherence for policy consistency, Gamali said. She added that a parliament consisting of a majority of opposition members could pose a challenge for Dissanayake, especially because the MPP campaign was driven on a very us versus them narrative. This makes it very hard for them now to say, let's work together. Even though he won the election, Dissanayake did not get the votes of many Tamils, who make up 12% of the population of 22 million and are the country's largest ethnic minority. All leading candidates of the race were Sinhalese. Opposition leader Premadasa won 40% of the cumulative vote across the country's Tamil majority areas. He has tried to appeal to Tamil voters even though his father, former President Ranasinghe Premadasa, was assassinated by a Tamil separatist group, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, in 1993. The ETAC backed Premadasa in the election. Dissanayake, on the other hand, said he does not regret supporting the Rajapaksa's government war against the Tamil Tigers. The civil war was quashed in 2009 under President Mahinda Rajapaksa after 26 years. Still, Dissanayake made a call for unity in his inauguration speech. There are things I know and things I don't know, but I will seek the best advice and do my best. For that, I need the support of everyone, he said. Tamil leaders have expressed optimism that Dissanayake will steer clear of sectarian politics. So with this unofficial colony of China, we can sadly see in the state of affairs that even though you had the other sort of leftists before Dissanayake, before this guy, who not only led a sectarian war against the Tamil Tigers for goddamn 26 years, but at the same time, it's also the fault of the Rajapaksa dynasty, which has been in power for quite a while, as it is really obvious. Simply that when the discussion came regarding propping up the country economically and in order to have some sort of economic development, they got sweet talked into doing really onerous deals with the People's Republic of China in order to get those loans and in order to have infrastructure being built in the country. And the most important uh, assets that the Chinese built was a new airport. I'm not sure if it was in Colombo or if it was in the other large city in the south, but there was also another port which was built in the south of the island, in the south of the country. And when, of course, the Chinese, just like everywhere else where they've been with the Belt and Road Initiative, they paid uh, really significant bribes in order to have in order to have the Belt and Road projects be pushed through the government. And Sri Lanka is of no exception. But the reason why Sri Lanka is a particularly glaring example of the Chinese neo-colonialism, which is more like a neo-slavery rather than neo-colonialism. It's still the country that that was at fault, and I'm not exactly sure if the people don't realize this, if the people don't remember, or if simply the people don't care about these sort of deals being done. Because simply because the reason why Sri Lanka is such a poor state economically is because the political class, and it's not like it's not like Dissanayake will change anything, or it's not like anybody else will change anything from this point of view. And when it comes back to the deals that made Sri Lanka default to the level where they had to call the IMF in order to bail them out, well, essentially, well, the way I see things, that at the grander scale, is that well, the Sri Lankans got into debt for some things that may have probably been useful, but nowhere near that level. There could have been much more sustainable domestic investment being done without the Chinese money. And on the other side, when the finances finally croaked and the Chinese came and forced them to sign 99-year concessions for both the airport and the port that they built, well, of course, especially when it comes to the port could also could be converted overnight into a military port, and suddenly the Chinese have a naval base mm, right right under India. And here it's also another thing that's worth discussing about when it comes to the situation in Sri Lanka. What exactly is India doing when it comes to taking care of its neighbors? I understand that the other neighbors of India are not exactly too pleasing. You have the Chinese on one side, you have the Pakistanis on the other, you have the Bangladeshis on the other, and now you have the Sri Lankans. But, uh, but but overall, I see that whatever the Chinese may be doing, either them directly or via Bangladesh or Pakistan, uh, mm, my main security concern would have been this new Chinese port, which could act as a Chinese naval base right at the southern tip of my country. And the southern tip of India is particularly important because that's where the Malayalam speaking population lives, particularly in the state of Kerala. And Kerala is also one of the bigger and also has some of the most educated people in India. And as a consequence, what are the Indian? Okay, I understand that the Indians are having their own plate full with governing the country as it is, but what exactly are they doing, or if they're doing anything regarding the situation with Sri Lanka? Now they got bailed out, but they've gotten bailed out by the IMF. So at least the Chinese have gotten their money back in one way or another. But on the other side, keeping Sri Lanka functioning as it is in this chaotic way is definitely not conducive to the overall health of the region, even if India is the biggest. But at the same time, it also poses security-related risks such as this one. Mm, with having direct Chinese assets essentially right behind you or right under your ass if we are to look at the placement geographically. Not exactly sure, but overall, I personally don't think that Sri Lanka, if you'll get better, you'll get better despite the government and despite the situation it's into, and not thanks to it. And if the political climate is as it is, where it's not a cohab, it may have been a cohabiting government, but if the campaign has been run against fuck the other guy and fuck that other guy's political party, mm, the writing on the wall is pretty obvious. If he will dissolve the parliament and if his party does not have sufficient support in order to build a majority, even if that majority is done by a coalition, then you're looking at gridlock. So congratulations, you're the president of a country that cannot do anything. You, or maybe that's also probably the aim of the president. If he can write as many executive orders as he wants, as long as nobody in the parliament can actually contest him, because there'll be a constant gridlock. I'm not sure. It remains to be seen. Moving on now, still tied to China in one way or another. The Straits Times. China's financial regulators announced raft of policy measures to support the economy. Oh no, it's like the Chinese economy isn't as going as great as we thought, or as great as they made us think. China's financial regulators have announced a broad raft of measures to support a slowing economy, aimed at boosting liquidity and lowering borrowing costs for individuals and companies alike. This comes as protracted deflationary pressures weigh on the world's second-largest economy and threaten to put the country's growth target of around 5% in 2024 out of reach. The measures include cuts to a key policy interest rate and existing mortgage rates, reductions to banks' cash reserves requirements, lower down payments for second homes, and more liquidity for the stock market. They were announced on the 24th of September at a rare press conference in Beijing by Central Bank Chief Pang Gongsheng, alongside the heads of the National Administration and Financial Regulation and the China Securities Regulatory Commission. The coordinated policy salvo, the magnitude of which exceeded expectations, will give an immediate lift to sentiment, which is the first positive step, said Mr. Shu Tianchen, a senior economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit in Beijing. This at least suggests that the government is serious about backstopping the economy and protecting the livelihoods of people, he added. Mr. Pan said cash holdings which commercial banks are required to keep in reserve, also known as the reserve requirement ratio, will drop 0.5 percentage point in the near future. This will make available an additional 1 trillion yuan for lending. The central bank will also cut a key short-term policy rate, also known as the 7-day reverse repo rate, by 0.2 percentage points, aimed at guiding interest rates on loans and deposits downwards. On the property front, the central bank will provide guidance for interest rate cuts on existing mortgages by half a percentage point on average, in a move that Mr. Pan estimates will save some 50 million households about 150 billion yuan in interest payments per year. Second-time homebuyers will also enjoy lower minimum down payment ratios of 15% from 25%, as is the case for first-timers. To boost the capital market, the central bank will set up a 500 billion yuan swap facility that allows eligible institutions to pledge assets in exchange for liquidity to buy stocks. Separately, a 300 billion yuan refinancing facility will encourage banks to provide loans to listed companies and major shareholders to buy back or increase their stakes. The unveiling of the stimulus measures boosted oil prices as well as stock markets worldwide, where agency Agence France-Presse reported, with the Hong Kong and Shanghai stock markets up by more than 4% by closing time on the 24th of September. China's latest monetary support measures come as analysts question whether it can attain its growth target of about 5% in 2024 amid a stubbornly weak domestic demand. Its economic growth slowed to 4.7% per year in the second quarter, while key indicators such as industrial output, retail sales, and real estate underwhelmed in August. China is due to report third-quarter GDP results on October the 18th. Maybank economist Erika Tai estimates that even with the latest monetary easing measures, China's most conservative since the start of 2023, the country's GDP will grow at 4.8% in 2024. The bank's director of macro research pointed out that the monetary policy works with a lag. The stimulus package was likely too late to have a significant effect on GDP in the remaining 3 months of the year, although it could boost growth marginally in 2025. More fundamentally, analysts underscore the need for more fiscal stimulus, government spending or tax cuts to better address weak demand in the Chinese economy. While monetary easing is welcome and important, it alone will not be enough to backstop the economy given the low appetite for borrowing, said the EIU's Mr. Shu. Dr. Zhang Jiwei, president and chief economist at Pinpoint Asset Management, said, "Fiscal policy is missing in today's press conference. I think fiscal policy is crucial and indispensable if the government wants to turn around the weak economic momentum." Said Maybank's Mr. Tay, "What the economy needs now is for the government to step up as a spender, not a lender of the last resort." Well, excuse me, but if China, of all the countries in this world, hasn't spent back into its domestic economy then I cannot exactly talk about what other countries did. You just have to look at the sheer amount of infrastructure that the CCP built within China, and some of the grandest projects that are right there. You have examples like the Three Gorges Dam, which is something that, let's be honest, if something even similar could have been conceived in Europe, we would get swamped for the better part of 10 to 15 years just in courts because of some environmentalist NGOs which may have rubles or yuans in their pockets, posting lawsuit after lawsuit because they're affecting some sort of migratory bird or rare bugs or some sort of reticulated worm in the ground. So, and on top of that, you also have the the Chinese high-speed rail system, which, let's be honest, I can understand the economic argument that not all of it is profitable. In fact, most of it has been built with no per with no other purpose other than military, which is to carry troops really quick from one point to another. But on the other side, well, it is something. Even if the entire system is running at a loss financially, you can't say that the Chinese government hasn't invested. Where else do you want them to invest? And that's what they've done constantly, because that's what the communist system does in general. Unless the economic situation is so bad, think for example. The 1980s era of stagnation in the Soviet Union. Only in other circumstances will the communist government not invest in the country, in the country that's at the end controlling it. So what Mistake says with the government being a spender and not a lender, mm, here I'm not exactly on her side, because the Chinese give credit where credit is due. Beijing does spend a lot. Does spend a lot, and it definitely makes a lot. And the bigger problem with the communist authorities in China is that while they spend a lot, they don't spend in directions which will be most viable. And this is a unique circumstance that can be understood best by people who lived in countries that practice 5-year plans, which tend to be mostly communist. But let's stick to China here. Well, China may not adhere so rigidly to the Stalinist 5-year plans as other communist countries used to or still do. See the case of North Korea. They still care about they still care about things and reaching some targets. The problem is that the system incentivizes you to do too much target seeking, based on the quotas and on the directives that you get from the central government, from Beijing, if you're a local authority, and if Beijing, of course, how the hell could some could a faceless bureaucrat from the CCP that lives in the capital know what sort of demand, know what sort of the things would a region like, say, Sichuan would require, or what sort of sort of investments, or what sort of infrastructure, and what sort of constructions would it benefit? It won't. It won't. But this is the nature of top-down institutions and top-down dictatorships like these. And so it's not like the local authorities can't do much. Is that they as well serve their own interests, just that they serve bigger interests themselves, promotions, grifts, political clienteles, and everything else. So it's obvious that things could have been better, but when you give a shit about more your political position rather than give a shit about the people, especially since the people are they're not the ones exactly keeping you there. It's because it's not that they appointed you, it's that the government appointed you there, or at least the government picked you out from the community. Mm, you get a situation that you find in China right now, and China is a fascinating country when you take in consideration that the China in the past decade used more concrete for construction than the entire world used for construction as well. And here we got taking into consideration that we also add that statistic, the reconstruction of countries after World War One and then after World War Two, and then other projects on both sides of the Iron Curtain. So China used in a decade more than the entire world used in over a century, since concrete is used in construction in one way or another. And then you start wondering, okay, China is a population-wise a big country, and they're also quite a big nation themselves. But goddamn, it's not like it's that big so that 1 billion people rival the consumption or the usage of the rest of the planet at the end, which represent the rest, depending on the rest of the world, which grew in population. Okay, just as China, but even the rest of the world grew as a population from 2 billion all the way to 8. That's a number that we got today. So where did all that concrete go? And the answer is pretty simple. It went into development projects. How well, what sort of income did those projects offer? What sort of other benefits did they offer? You don't know unless you're there and you're looking, and when you're discussing with the people and those that were part of those projects. But it's not like well, China experiences weak domestic demand because even the Chinese do not have the optimism, but especially after the pandemic. While you may look from the perspective of a person living in the capital that, oh my God, things are so amazing because we have everything and there's everything here. Well, then there's the capital, and then there's the rest of the country, and the rest of the country. Say for example, in Shanghai experienced when it comes to industrial services but at the very end of the pandemic. So that was early 2023 for China. It wasn't 2022 like it was for Europe and the West. Mm, so those the calculation done back then is that about 75% of industrial businesses closed down in China, in the Shanghai area, and those haven't come back. So when you have this phenomenon happening at a national level with a lot of industries and a lot of sectors which closed down and never opened after the pandemic, of course that the people are skittish when it comes to spending and investing. because if they saw that their job or their friend's job or their family's job or God knows who else, if not only they no longer have jobs, or if their friends don't have jobs, but if they don't find any either, at least comparable to what they had. And let's be honest, it's not like what they had was great after all. Then of course that they're going to be anxious to spend the money. And I'm of the same opinion as this guy from Pinpoint Asset Management. Okay, there is fiscal policy that is definitely missing. What exactly is the CCP going to do with the yuan? Are they going to print more in order to get some inflation, or are they going to let this deflationary, or are they going to print a little in order to at least bring the deflation to 0% rather than what is it, about 4%, which is right now? Well, I'm not sure, but in the end, the consequence of our actions today, we will see them in time, sometime in the future. Speaking of that, what consequences could there be from investing literal boatloads of money into a specific industry, only to discover that you don't exactly have who to sell your stuff to? South China Morning Post: China's EV exporters, dealers squeezed at home and abroad as price war rages. Rounds of price cuts by China's car dealers are being mirrored overseas as manufacturers take losses to gain a foothold in global markets. A domestic price war has brought prices so low, with embattled dealers have urged the government to intervene. Customs data shows Chinese car makers are also slashing prices in overseas markets to stay competitive. Well, that's obvious. The, the Chinese stuff can't exactly expect it to sell for Mercedes prices. While China's exports in August were at the highest in 2024, prices for electric vehicles have been steadily declining. The export value of Chinese EVs rose year-on-year last month, but the 3.73% registered was below the 10% growth rate observed at the number of units exported. This translates to a 5.74% year-on-year decline in EV prices and an 11.67% drop for the first 8 months. This trend is particularly evident in the European Union, where a hotly contested trade investigation over imported EVs from China continues to play out. Although China's EV export prices to the EU saw a slight year-on-year increase in August due to provisional tariffs, overall prices dropped by 10.56% compared to the previous month. At home, the downward spiral is even more pronounced. Chinese dealers have lost $19.55 billion in the first 8 months of the year, largely due to deep discounts offered in a desperate effort to stimulate sales, the China Automobile Dealers Association, CADA, said on Monday. See what I was saying earlier about Chinese. Dealers are facing significant losses in new car sales, with widespread cash flow deficits and heightened risks of capital chain ruptures, making it increasingly difficult for them to survive, CADA said in a post on its WeChat account. The association attributed the downturn to weak consumer demand and inventory backlogs, which have forced dealers to sell at a loss to ease financial pressures. Existing liquidity has been squeezed to the limit, it added. In August, CADA said the overall discount rate for new cars and light trucks reached 17.4%, a slight easing from the 19% recorded in the previous month. The association has urged Beijing to promptly implement relief measures to head off systemic risks in the sector, including encouraging financial institutions to enhance funding and loan support for showrooms. In an unwelcome omen for the world's largest vehicle market, Grand Automotive Services Group, one of the country's biggest car dealers, was removed from the Shanghai Stock Exchange effective August 28, after shares traded below their par value for 20 consecutive days. Oh, so you're trying to tell me that the biggest car dealers in your country get struck off the stock exchange because they've been trading below their certain stock price value for too long. That definitely isn't a good sign if I ever saw one. Leaving aside the fact that, well, of course, just like anywhere else in the planet, it's not like you can trust the prices on any stock market, especially the Chinese one, that said the stock price may be the real one, or that if a higher price means that the business is doing well, well, that may sometimes be the case, but who knows what other machinations could be happening there and what interest groups are fighting over this. But overall, as I mentioned in an earlier article regarding EVs and China, and especially the debate on on how big will the tariffs be in the EU when these cars will be imported, because hell, finally, just as I mentioned in one of the last podcasts before I went on vacation, uh, to some extent, it's good that the EU has woken up and they realized the way China is operating, but it remains to be seen with the EU interest groups who exactly is going to win. If I were to be a betting man, I would say that the tariffs will be sufficiently large in order to not threaten the German automakers, because it's always been like that. The EU did exactly the same when it came to import fees on American cars, and then we can see that in this circumstance. There are other different players at work here. Take, for example, well, one of the conditions, and this is what other countries which are not in Europe, which manufacture cars, did, and it's also what the Americans did, and also what the Japanese are doing. It's that they either build their factories within Europe and they manufacture the products within Europe in order to not have it, to not have a certain product. Take in this scenario a car, which because of the import duties, those import duties specifically there to protect the European car maker industry, which happen to most to be German or owned by the Germans outright, if not they're owned by the French. Simply to force the manufacturers to build at home, and that's what the Chinese don't like, because even if the development costs have already been amortized and at the same time it's not like the Chinese aren't selling in their own country. That was never the aim. The aim for the Chinese was to dominate an overseas market with and with electric cars. It just happens to be the other market which they don't which the CCP set its sights on to dominate. The problem is that in the automakers market, the interests are also too numerous, but the interests are also too pricey in order to pull stunts, just like what the Chinese did with solar panels. This is another example that I mentioned in earlier podcasts with how cheaply produced Chinese solar panels, because solar panel manufacturing is a very dirty business, which has the very dirty-ish production processes, but also really dangerous chemicals inside. Like, take for example mercury. When you're a country like China, where the environmental regulations are 0 point nothing, of course, that building things that have dirty manufacturing processes will yield you a much cheaper wholesale price than you will be to make the same thing in a country with actual environmental regulations and other sort of security-based or workplace safety regulations, like it happens to be in Europe. And Europe is a really good example because it's the opposite end of what's happening in China. In China, the regulations are there mostly for them to be present for the Guailos who look into China and say, "Oh yeah, look, this is a very civilized country. See, they have these many laws, and this is what they're saying that they're doing." While on the opposite end, people don't talk much about regulations in Europe unless they're really intrusive and really absurd. Say, for example, GDPR or the most recent one where there was an entire battle on investments into green energies, and the nuclear energy was not put on the list up until about half of the EU went against Brussels and said, "Well, screw you. Well, we'd like to have nuclear. We don't want to be like the Germans that you happen to be most of, to not have any nuclear power plants. Are you insane? We're going to need electricity." And lo and behold, years later, with the conflict in Ukraine and then with the subsequent destabilizations brought by technologies such as electric cars and e-scooters and electric fuck knows what, suddenly countries realize that their power grids may not be as solid as they thought, particularly when they have also these absurd ideals like net zero or banning internal combustion engines by 2035 or 20 fuck knows what. I'm personally banking on the fact that said regulations will not last for too long, because somebody will wake up at some point to realize that no, this is way too much, this is way too expensive, and we cannot afford financially or uprooting our society in order for cows not to fart and generate methane and break a hole in the ozone layer. Come on, it's absurd. But more and more of those will be coming. So herein lies the comparison, and reiterating this point I made in the earlier podcast. That's how the European solar industry died. That's how the American solar industry died. Simply because in a country which has completely different and more lax rules of operating such a business. And ends up dominating the market simply by the power of price. That's what the Chinese tried and keep on trying to do with electric vehicles. That is mostly because China still and will still be dominant when it comes to lithium battery manufacture. Let's hope that the Japanese or the Koreans or somebody will be spearheading some progress when it comes to solid state batteries, because if we're going to remain stuck for too long with these lithium batteries, and if China were to go the way it wants to, by absolutely steamrolling other car manufacturing industries with cheaply built EVs, then that's going to be really painful. It's going to be really painful for those countries which rely on auto manufacturing, and things when downturns happened they haven't already been too great back then. See, for example, what happened with the big three automakers in the US when the economy croaked in 2007. It is a good point to avoid such a scenario. Uh, that is if you want to keep those people employed, and if you want to have this auto industry. Okay. Uh, for now on, fundamentals work in favor of the traditional manufacturers. But if the Chinese were to have their own way, and they're working towards that, this article doesn't mention the fact that, and I don't think it would have. It doesn't mention the fact that that I think BYD or a company affiliated to BYD is planning to build an EV car factory in Szeged in Hungary. And this is also tied to another aspect when it comes to discussing the import tariffs on Chinese EVs. Peter Szijjártó, the foreign minister of Hungary, mentioned that when the vote in the European Parliament will be coming regarding the import taxes on Chinese EVs, Hungary will be voting against. And for those import duties to be actually implemented, the EU needs to have a unanimous consensus. So you cannot have even one single country saying no, because if a single country says no, then the law isn't passing. And if these import duties will not be passed, then we're going to witness from that moment on, up until probably some other administration will be thinking of implementing import duties, we may see the real decline of the European automaker industry. In case they don't wake up by then and simply just crumple up and torch the net zero or green by 2050 or other bullshit laws like these. So this is about it from the 12th episode. Good to see you back. Thank you very much for watching. And since I'm at the end of the podcast, normally I should have mentioned this at the very beginning. You may most likely see that the image quality is much better. Thank you for whoever provided the means to me. You know very well who you are, and it's definitely appreciated. Now, with the audio situation, this may have to be resolved at some point. Well, currently, this also, as I said, depends on you, because the solution that I was thinking of and the solution that an associate thought of for me, mm, it's pricey in itself, and so far, um, uh, living where I live, and those who watch this podcast definitely know the discussions about the rent prices in the UK and the rent prices where I live and where I'm obligated to live, because I definitely looked for alternatives around this area, and where I may be saving money in one way, I may end up spending money in another due to distance, parking fees, and general unreliability of public transport. So this project, this podcast, still remains in many ways supported financially by me and by few donors. You know who you are, and I appreciate your effort. So, and that's when the audio upgrade may be coming at some point, depending on what will be happening, and who knows. So that's right. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next week. Cheers.